Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto acts like Kakashi sensei. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by Obi-quiet and link in description and support writer. Let's start the video. Naruto grunted and strained against the ropes holding him to the log again. And again his attempts at freeing himself failed for the 100th time that day. Some team he had, leaving him behind like this. Of course he'd get out of it. He didn't need them, after all, but man, this sucked. He slumped as his stomach growled again. He looked up at the sun that had crawled farther along in the sky. It would be evening soon and he still hadn't eaten more than a couple of bites of food all day. He hated going without food. Few things made him feel weaker. But if anyone thought this would make him give up, he'd show them how wrong they were. With that little mental pep talk out of the way, he renewed his efforts, grunting and straining against the ropes again. And he might have actually succeeded, too, had a figure stumbling into the clearing not distracted him. The guy looked kinda weird for a ninja. He had shoulder-length dark hair and half of it covered one of his eyes, kind of like Kakashi sensei, now that Naruto thought about it. He wore a brown poncho and a wrap around his forehead. His pants looked worn but were otherwise typical ninja pants, and his ninja boots and legs up to his knees had been wrapped in dark strips of cloth. He had a walking stick in one hand that he was leaning rather heavily on. He looked weak, in Naruto's opinion. What kind of ninja just stumbled around like that? The guy looked up and around, eye wide as he blinked, or at least, Naruto assumed it was blinking as he still couldn't see the second eye. "Oh," the man finally said aloud. He had a soft voice that just made Naruto want to smack him one. Why could weak people like this guy be ninjas? Well, he had to fight for every single ounce of recognition he got. The guy had to be a ninja, though, because no one else could get into the training grounds Naruto had tried before, and if he couldn't do it, no one could. "Who are you?" Naruto finally called out, thoroughly unimpressed. "What are you doing here?" The man turned his lone, black eye on Naruto, and his visible eyebrow crept towards his hairline. "Oh," he said again. Then he put his hand to his chin, the one with the walking stick in it even. It looked so weird. "What do you mean, oh, you jerk?" Naruto yelled and went to rush the guy only to remember he was still tied to the log, so only ended up thrashing his legs. Still, that wouldn't stop Naruto from giving this guy a piece of his mind. "Just wait till I get out of this. Then I'll come over there and kick your butt." He wasn't quite sure why he wanted to beat this guy down, except that he looked so weak and he just happened to be right there. The man just blinked for several seconds before he slowly approached and then squatted in front of Naruto, just out of reach of his kick. "What are you looking at, huh?" Naruto yelled, kicking out at the guy again. To his surprise, the weak-looking ninja spoke a full sentence for the first time since he arrived. "How long have you been here?" he asked. Naruto got over his surprise at being approached and not shouted at quickly, only to pout at the question. "Why? I'm just practicing my ninja skills. Ninja have to get out of situations like this, you know." The man tipped his head to one side, studying Naruto intently. "That's not what I asked." "So what?" the blonde replied. "You gonna tell me I'm weak just cause I've been tied up here since noon? Huh?" To his surprise, again, the man didn't. He just blinked, then sighed. "No one taught you how to get out of ropes, did they?" Naruto felt his eyes go wide. "Wait, there actually is training for this?" he asked. The man closed his eye and put his hand to the bridge of his nose while still holding his walking stick. "So weird. It's supposed to be taught in the academy." "Oh. That explained that. But he'd gotten along without all of that so far, so why did he need it now? I don't need that stuff," he exclaimed. "I'm fine on my own. I'm awesome like that and I'll figure this out. Then I'll kick your butt." The man raised his eyebrow, now looking thoroughly unimpressed himself. "Why?" he asked. "For looking down on me? I'm the future Hokage, you know," Naruto responded, kicking out again. The man chuckled, which only caused Naruto's anger to build further. "You don't think I can?" he challenged. The man just smiled, a very, very small smile, although it wasn't one of the cruel smiles Naruto had grown so used to on adults. "I believe you." Naruto stopped kicking out as he felt his eyes widen in surprise. You do?" The guy just nodded, smile gone and face completely blank again. Those words weren't usual. "Why?" Naruto heard himself ask before he could think better of it. The man just shrugged. "Because you wanted." But then why didn't anyone else acknowledge him like that? Before Naruto could figure out something to say, the man sighed and spoke again. "Would you like to know how to get out of ropes?" The blonde's breath caught in his throat. "I guess," he finally muttered. "Not that I need it or anything," he quickly added on. The man just nodded as if he completely agreed with Naruto. This was getting really weird. Naruto had wanted acknowledgement his entire life, so why did it feel weird? There are several methods for escaping rope. The genin method wouldn't be useful in this situation as you're tied bodily to the trunk. Normally, you would have to the man started, then went on to explain how to present oneself when being tied up, then what to do if that went wrong or one was unconscious when tied up. Then he went on to ask what Naruto could move at that point. By my head, my hands and my legs, the blonde replied, still pouting a little, but what the man had explained was interesting. Can you move your shoulder and arm at all? Naruto frowned and thought about that, then he tried to. He could move his arm up a bit. Work with that and see if you can figure out how to get that out. But what if I have to get out fast? Naruto whined, even as he focused on trying to get his arm out of the rope. Kakashi sensei had tied it really tight, but he was making progress, little by little. Then hope you have chakra. Naruto frowned. Chakra? The man sighed. The energy that allows you to hinge in Kawarimi. Oh, that stuff, Naruto said, recognizing what Iruka sensei had explained to him a couple of times when he hadn't really been listening. Then he snorted. I have chakra now. Hey, wait. Is there a super cool jutsu for this? He asked, completely emphasizing the accusation in his voice. The guy should have told him that to begin with. You need to know how to escape without chakra too. Why? He pouted. Because you can't always use chakra. Getting out of traps like this takes time and patience. But I want out now, Naruto said again. He was hungry, dang it. Is that being patient? The man asked pointedly, voice dry. Naruto sighed. No. You sound like Iruka sensei. He didn't notice the man's eyes widening or the slight redness that came to his cheeks. Instead, the blonde went back to working his arm out of the rope. He could almost get his elbow, but he had to move his arm really weird and didn't have enough space to. Then he grit his teeth and pulled as hard as he could. The rope hurt and scraped his arm, but it finally came out. And once he did that, he could move the rest of his arm out pretty easily. Hey. I did it. He said happily, showing the man. Good, the man replied with a nod. Can you get out of the rope now? Is it loose enough? Naruto struggled and strained and felt the rope give a little more than it had before. Not a lot, but just enough. I think so, he said, pulling on the ropes with his newly freed hand. After another couple of seconds, he got his other hand out and began pulling at the different ropes. Not long after that, he stepped away from the log, beaming. See? I told you I could get loose. The man nodded, looking utterly serious. I never doubted you. Naruto actually really appreciated the guy now. Thanks, he finally muttered, rubbing the back of his head and looking away. Iruka sensei said he had to be polite to people, and this guy had been really nice, considering. Even if he still looked weak. I mean, I don't want to beat you up now. You're welcome. The surroundings fell into silence for several seconds while Naruto tried to think of something to say to the guy he'd been threatening earlier. The guy who turned out to be pretty cool after all. So, what's your name? He asked. I'm Uzumaki Naruto. The man just blinked down at him for several seconds and Naruto almost wanted to take it back. The guy might not have known, although how, Naruto didn't know everyone knew him, for better or worse, and now he might not be so nice. What if he hadn't recognized Naruto? Would his face twist up in the disgust the orphan had become so used to seeing? His stomach twisted up in a knot and he was about to say something before the man finally spoke. Indra. Call me Indra. And he said it just as calmly as normal, no hint of disgust. Maybe he didn't know about the fox. Naruto just grinned. So, Indra, have you ever had ramen? Indra just blinked. Indra had insisted on a henge before going into town and his henge was pretty cool. It looked almost as good as Naruto's. He'd said that he was on a long-term mission and some people might not recognize him and might attack them if he didn't henge, so Naruto suggested Iruka sensei. For some reason, the guy sighed at that. But he also henged into Iruka sensei and accompanied Naruto to the food stand and even said he'd pay for the food. Naruto thanked him profusely and then almost slipped up and introduced his new friend to Old Man Tucci and Amni, but he remembered just in time. Indra didn't have much to say to Naruto, usually responding to questions with grunts or HN sound. He was almost as bad as the team, although seemed nicer and friendlier for some reason the Jinchuriki didn't quite understand. Indra even gave him the idea that he could have used his cage bushin to untie him earlier. When he'd asked how, the man had pointed out that he'd freed his hands, however it might be really useful for him to get to a point where he didn't need to use a sign to summon his cage bushin. What a cool idea. He decided he liked Indra. He did seem genuinely surprised at how much food Naruto ate, even going so far as to mutter something about how he thought it would be far less as a child, whatever that meant. Then he bid Naruto farewell and told him to keep practicing his ability to escape. It might save his life one day. Then he disappeared down a street with a wave of his hand, the one still holding the walking stick. Huh, what a weird guy, Naruto muttered, then shrugged and turned to go home, much happier than he'd been earlier that day. Besides, now he was officially a genin. How cool was that? He skipped home and went to bed that night with a smile on his face and a new precious person he would do anything to protect. 24-year-old Uchiha Sasuke looked over Konoha from his perch on the fourth Hokage's head, the closest he could get to the stone head he was used to sitting on, but he had to make do with his best friend's father instead. He took what comfort he could from it, as his current situation really made him want to find the nearest bar and get completely and utterly soused, but he knew that would ultimately make everything worse. Getting someone with a Rinnegan drunk always ended poorly. Instead, he forced himself to focus on the situation and piece together what exactly had happened to him. The last thing he remembered was stepping through a portal opened by his Rinnegan eye to check on Kagaya's prison, something he did fairly regularly to keep his paranoia at bay. But instead of the smooth transition to his intended destination that he'd expected, he'd somehow stopped abruptly and been thrown. No, it felt more like he hit a wall and had then fallen down a flight of metaphorical stairs, or several. At least, that was the closest comparison he could think of. He'd ended up on a very familiar training ground, one that had been destroyed years before in Pain's attack on the village. That had confused him initially, unsurprisingly, and still did to a small extent. Why would he end up here of all places and times? Here when the man he respected most among the living had been left tied to a log on the day they'd passed their final genin exam. His two high-level Dojutsu confirmed almost instantly that he hadn't been placed under any form of Genjutsu, and so he could only conclude that he had accidentally traveled back in time. As implausible as that sounded. So he dealt with the situation trying to be as calm and patient with a young, bull-headed Naruto as he could be. He'd forgotten how bad his best friend used to be, although that gave him hope for some of Konoha's future generation, and now he had to figure out what to do. His first thought had been to keep the timeline pure, simply because he could seriously screw up the future if he didn't. Teaching Naruto how to escape ropes didn't count, and the kid needed to know things like that for his future anyway. Besides, it was so small, it couldn't hurt, right? Then he thought back to some of the prevailing theories on time travel he'd studied, mainly due to the surprising amount of tales and anecdotes regarding people with high-powered Dojutsu having issues with time. If those theories were true, him going back this far should have created a branching timeline. Of course, that could only be true if there were now two Uchiha Sasukes in the timeline, and so he'd sneaked into the Uchiha compound and verified that his younger self was, indeed, here. In truth, seeing his younger self had been relieving. It meant his actions wouldn't directly affect his original time for better or ill, which, in turn, meant he didn't have to worry about losing his own present. Which meant that he could honestly do just about anything he wanted in the here and now. It was a heady feeling, knowing just how much he could screw with the future if he wanted to. He considered trying to get back to his own timeline and just leaving well enough alone, but he didn't know if he could undo the accident enough to get him home to the right time, let alone the right dimension. Which meant he'd have to wait for Naruto to come and find him, because he had little doubt the Uzumaki would, even if it meant defying all expectations and natural laws, because hey, it wouldn't be the first time, and in the meantime, well. The penultimate Uchiha considered his options. He could go his usual route by, again, just leaving well enough alone, sitting back and just watching to see how the situation unfolded, then stepping in if he had to. He doubted he would actually have to do anything. He knew most of what the future held, and while that was likely the most intelligent route, it also sounded incredibly boring to him. It also felt wrong somehow to sit back and not do anything, and he wondered just when the dope had rubbed off on him so much. He could go the Naruto route, he supposed. It would be interesting at least. If he just went in and told everyone the absolute truth and then dealt with whatever consequences came, he could just imagine the look on Kakashi's face when he told him about his future as the sixth Hokage. That was honestly almost amusing enough to just go with it, but the idea of dealing with the fallout with the current third Hokage, or even worse, Danzo, did not appeal to him. But that out of the way, he moved on to the next idea, taking the Sakura route. Just insert himself here and there and punch through anything that he didn't like. That actually sounded like a very appealing option. Or the Kakashi route and just troll everyone while observing the situation and showing up with low-key interactions while subtly teaching the past versions of his friends and family why any given situation was or wasn't the best idea. He had to admit, screwing with his arrogant past self did sound very amusing. As entertaining as the Sakura route would be, the Kakashi route seemed even better. It would also be a good way to head off some potentially damaging problems in the future. Or he could combine them. He felt a smile come to his lips that would undoubtedly make even his wife step back warily. It would probably make the future 7th Hokage either sigh with resignation or prepare to meet Sasuke's challenge. He chuckled quietly to himself as he stood. Trolling everyone it would be. Starting with Danzo. It wouldn't be difficult to infiltrate routes since, you know, he could make portals and had an unbeatable Genjutsu. This would be so cathartic. Hiruzen woke to the flaring of chakra and immediately stood to unseal his door. Outside, he found one of his Anbu kneeling in submission. The others had remained at their stations. Okage-sama, the Anbu, rat, started, I bring you news. Shimura-sama has been placed in the hospital. The Hokage frowned. Why? His arm and eye are missing. Hiruzen felt his breath catch. Danzo, even now, was no pushover. Whoever could do that to him was a threat he would have to address, unless it had been a training accident, but somehow, the Hokage doubted it. He also felt his heart sink at his old friend's predicament. The advisor already couldn't use his bandaged arm, and he only had one eye left. So he is blind, he muttered. No, Hokage-sama, the Anbu replied. Hiruzen frowned again. Explain. The eye that was taken was his already damaged eye. Well, that made no sense. Why would someone take that eye? He asked. I was under the impression that it had been damaged beyond repair. The Anbu, to their credit, didn't so much as fidget. Head medic Oba has asked for you, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen didn't sigh, but he wanted to. He'd already gotten to bed late. He was too old for this job. He'd been too old for almost 2 decades now. Yes, I will be right there, he said and closed his door to get dressed. 2 minutes later, he appeared at the Konoha hospital. The girl at the front desk, a genin who had never passed her teacher's test, jumped at the sight of him, but she immediately gave him directions to find Oba-san. He followed them and 2 more minutes later, he found the man in question. The head healer was a short man, with dark green hair slicked back into a low ponytail and large round glasses. He'd been a Chunin, but had never gone very far in the traditional ranks, as he had focused more on healing after obtaining his promotion, simply staying in the hospital to work as a medic. He was one of the oldest medics there, had even been there when Tsunade had been in charge of the hospital during the war. Oba-san, Hiruzen said seriously. The man looked up at the Hokage and straightened his back, likely hoping to hide the tired slump of his shoulders. Okage-sama, he said. Earlier tonight, Shimura-san was left in front of the hospital. Hiruzen frowned. Left. The green-haired man nodded, looking nervous. He was not checked in by anyone, simply appearing in front of the building. No one was seen in the vicinity. Hiruzen always had operatives watching the hospital. He would have to check in with them. I see, he said before gesturing for the man to continue. In any case, he seemed to be suffering from a hallucination of some kind. If it is a genjutsu, though, it isn't one we can break. He also had some blood loss as his arm had been completely severed at the shoulder. His left arm? The Hokage asked. The man shook his head. No, his right arm. The right arm that had already been severely damaged? The Hokage asked. Oba-san shifted nervously. Well, you see, that's not the only thing, Hokage-sama. His arm is already growing back. Hiruzen's eyes widened. What? He asked. The medic shook his head. I don't know what to make of it, he said as he handed over a sheet with his observations written down. His skin and areas around his arm looked pale and patchy, so we took a sample, thinking it was a poison. We merely found human cells, but they're modified, heavily. They have excessive healing, and I'm waiting on the DNA results. They should be here any minute because they aren't originally Shimura-san's. The thing is, Hokage-sama, with the results we've already seen and the cells we found, Shimura-san likely had full use of his arm. We've found active chakra pathways leading to said arm and the same to his eye. A third closed his eyes as the implications ran through his head. So, just to be clear, you are saying that Shimura-san has had full use of both his arm and eye for an unknown amount of time? Oba-san nodded. All results we've seen are saying that, yes sir. So Danzo had lied to him. Well, it wouldn't be the first time. Is he still under the effects of the genjutsu? Hiruzen asked after several breaths. Yes, sir, the medic nodded, nervously. Let me see him, the Hokage ordered. Yes, sir, Oba-san said, sounding relieved. He turned and began to lead Hiruzen down the hall, but a voice calling out stopped them. Oba-san. We need you to. The medic nin running up to them, a brown-haired girl with black eyes, stopped short when she realized who else was in the hall. Hokage-sama. My apologies, she said, bowing low. Hiruzen waved her off. No harm done, he said, forcing a smile. She looked up, relieved. What is it, Matsuo-san? Oba-san asked. The girl swallowed, glanced between the two of them, and then focused on her medic superior. Sir, Uchiha Sasuke has just shown up with well an arm, sir. They both stared at her. The severed arm. It seems to have multiple Sharingan eyes implanted into it. Hiruzen and Oba both balked. Excuse me? They asked at the same time, then shot each other glances before returning their attention to the messenger. She looked between them again before pleadingly turning to the Hokage. Please come and see for yourself, she said. After a moment's contemplation, Hiruzen nodded. He and Oba followed her down the hall. He felt bad leaving Danzo in his current predicament, but a Sharingan arm? He suddenly realized this would be a very long night. Chapter 2. Hiruzen practically stumbled into his office very late the next day. Last night had been a nightmare. Danzo had somehow implanted an enhanced version of Hashirama Senju cells into himself, and then multiple Sharingan, because of course the severed arm Uchiha Sasuke had brought in a nearly blind panic, belonged to Danzo too, according to the cells found in said arm, and they still hadn't woken him from whatever he was under. In truth, Hiruzen suspected a Sharingan-induced Genjutsu, but he didn't like those implications. Still, he'd be contacting Itachi himself. Get to the bottom of this if he had to. That was one of the two explanations he could come up with at the moment, and thus he would have to look into it. Thankfully, the other potential explanation was sitting on the windowsill of his office reading a familiar little orange book as he entered. "Shame on you, Hokage-sama," Kakashi said as he flipped a page. "I know one of my vices is being late, but I didn't think it would rub off on you." Hiruzen had to take a deep breath at that. Part of him found Kakashi's comment amusing. Part of him found it highly disrespectful and annoying. He was running low enough on patience that the latter seemed to be winning. Well, that and the fact that he really didn't want to have this conversation with this particular ninja, but didn't have much of a choice. The man was involved due to his eye and his student. Instead of getting angry or even laughing, though, Hiruzen just plopped into his Hokage's chair with a soft groan. His back hurt so much. Growing old was not for the faint of heart. He looked over to see one concerned eye staring at him and decided to just get this all over with. "Where were you last night, Kakashi-san?" he asked. Kakashi blinked and then slowly, as if he expected an attack, put his orange book away, eyeing the Hokage warily. "Guy managed to drag me out to a bar and we had one of our competition nights by no choice of my own, I guarantee. I finally convinced him to head home around 2 in the morning. So, around the time Hiruzen had been woken. Can anyone else vouch for you?" the Hokage asked. Not that it mattered with elemental and kage bushins, but it could help. The silver-haired Jounin's expression turned suspicious. "Yes. I can give you a list if you like." Hiruzen nodded. "Please do." "Hokage-sama," Kakashi started slowly, "what happened?" Hiruzen sighed again. Then he explained everything. Danzo, the advanced Senju cells, the severed arm, both Danzo and the arm randomly appearing, the loss of Danzo's left eye, that was likely a Sharingan, the traumatized genin that they would have to explain everything to now. Hiruzen had every intention of throwing Danzo under the bus with that one, and all the implications thereof, everything from a spy to Sharingan-induced Genjutsu, to Danzo's multiple Kakei Genkai theft, and thus treason. Along with having to look into everything the man had done up until that point, which meant he'd have to look into root, and he was not looking forward to that. Once he finished he sat back, reaching for his pipe and preparing to light it. He saw Kakashi open his mouth out of the corner of his eye. "You are not allowed to say, 'I told you so' on pain of me leaving this hat to you." Kakashi immediately closed his mouth with a clop and said nothing. "Good." Then he finished lighting his pipe and put it in his mouth, taking in a breath of the sweet weed he preferred. It went a long way to relaxing him, as short as the fix would be. Then he turned his gaze on Kakashi again. Uchiha Sasuke is currently in the hospital being treated for shock. Later today, he will begin his mandatory mind healing sessions with Yamanaka and Oichi. During those sessions, Yamanaka-san will begin to prepare him to eventually receive the truth about Itachi, which he will be told when he is mentally able to handle it. Kakashi's eye widened. "Truth, Hokage-sama." He didn't groan, but it was a near thing. Apparently, Itachi killed his clan because they were planning a coup that would have destroyed Konoha. He was ordered to do so by Danzo. The silver-haired Jounin was not, by any means, stupid. He read the subtext, put 2 and 2 together, and then Hiruzen had to look away from the horror and subsequent disappointment. "That is an S-class secret." "Yes, Hokage-sama," Kakashi said quietly. Good thing Hiruzen had dismissed his Anbu once he'd gotten Kakashi's denial that he'd been the one to attack Danzo. Team 7 will have to, officially, be on suspension for the next several weeks. Kakashi's blank expression didn't change. "Yes, Hokage-sama." Oh, he was really upset if he'd reverted to Anbu mode instead of his lazy, sharp-tongued quipping mode. Hiruzen rubbed his temple. To be fair, he kind of deserved Kakashi's ire. "We also have to look into this. Someone attacked Danzo, and I need to know who yesterday. As such, you will be required to see T&I later today." A subtle flinch, but completely understandable. That was never something any ninja wanted to hear. "Yes, Hokage-sama. Inform the rest of your team. You can train them once you are cleared again. If you are not cleared, I will arrange something else. They will be taken care of, I promise." Not that his promises meant much these days. No emotions or reaction. "Yes, Hokage-sama." Hiruzen took another breath of his pipe and ignored the headache building behind his eyes. Dismissed. Kakashi vanished. He didn't walk over to the window and jump out like he'd taken to doing lately, but outright disappeared with a shunshin. Just like when he'd been in Anbu. Hiruzen made a subtle chakra fluctuation, so the current Anbu waiting nearby would tail the silver-haired Jounin until he showed up at T&I. Then he once again lamented his lost retirement. It was hard to remember a time when he'd actually been good at this job. Naruto grumbled as he shuffled along, kicking rocks, hands in his pockets. He hadn't noticed exactly where he'd gone and thus hadn't realized he'd ended up back at the training ground where he'd passed the final genin test yesterday. "Naruto," a voice had him looking up and he met Indra's single eye. That managed to chase away a lot of his gloom. "Hey, Indra-san," he said with a grin. "What's wrong?" the man asked. Naruto's face fell again. "My team was supposed to start missions today, but something happened to Sasuke team and Kakashi sensei said that we'd have to work on our own training for the day. I know we're supposed to have graduated finally, but this doesn't feel like graduation. We were supposed to start missions today. Instead the team's in the hospital and Sakura-chan ran off to get him some sort of get-well present and now I'm all alone again." "Ah," Indra said. Then he seemed to think for a second. "You don't know what D-rank missions given to new genin are, do you?" He didn't say it as a question. Naruto frowned. "Well, aren't we supposed to rescue princesses and protect the daimyo and stuff?" Indra blinked, then closed his eye and shook his head. "D-rank missions are easy missions in the village that basically equate to chores." The blonde just stared at the older ninja. Then, after several seconds. "What?" The older man held up his hand and walking stick placatingly. He opened his mouth as if to explain, but then closed it again and seemed to think about it. Then he gestured for Naruto to come forward. "Would you give the Hokage hat to just anyone?" he finally asked. The blonde froze in his tracks, looking affronted. "Of course not. It has to go to the strongest ninja. That's why I'm gonna earn it one day, Dadabeo." "How do you prove you're the strongest ninja?" Naruto opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out because he'd never really thought about it before. "By winning fights and fulfilling missions," he finally answered. Indra nodded, partially. "You also have to earn the trust of your fellow ninja and likely several clans." "Oh," Naruto replied, then thought about it. He frowned. "How do I do that?" "That's something you have to figure out on your own." His frown deepened. "Oh. Fulfilling missions is a good start, though," Indra conceded. "But you can't become Hokage if you're not alive to do that. Would you want to send Sakura up against a whole group of missing nin?" Naruto shook his head, worriedly. "She might get hurt." Indra nodded in agreement. "Right now, she isn't strong enough and doesn't know her team well enough to fight off something like that. When you leave the village, you have to completely trust your team. They will save you when you come across threats you can't handle." "I can handle anything," Naruto said, trying to sound sure, but it came off as shaky. "There are threats even the Hokage can't handle," Indra responded dryly. Naruto felt his eyes widen. "Nah." He protested angrily, "Hokage Jiji is the strongest." Indra shook his head sadly. "He's a very strong ninja, one of the strongest, but he's also old, well past his prime and tired. Most of the other Kage would give him a run for his money and there are a group of S-class missing nin who could be very problematic for any village, not to mention Orochimaru and—" "Wait, who?" The blonde butted in, wanting to defend his Jiji more but not knowing who these people even were. "Orochimaru is a Sannin, a missing nin and the Hokage's student. He's one of the strongest ninja in the world and is likely just as strong as if not stronger than the Hokage." Naruto didn't know what a seinen was and hadn't known Hokage Jiji had even had a student. But still. "He's still not stronger than Hokage Jiji," Naruto insisted, almost desperately. Indra sighed, then came over and squatted down in front of the blonde. "My point is that there are some very real threats outside the village, threats even the top Jounin would have problems with. Those are the kinds of threats you have to survive to even get a chance to become Hokage. So, of course they won't send newly minted genin outside of the gate until they have had more personalized training that can help them survive. B-rank missions, like weeding gardens and painting fences, are controlled activities that can prepare you for the real world." "Weeding gardens?" Naruto yelped. "How does that prepare us for missions outside the village?" he asked, angrily. Indra shrugged. "Well, if someone had a water jutsu, they can practice using that to water gardens and gain better control of their jutsu. If someone has an earth jutsu, they can use that to try and target only certain weeds, just as in a battle. Then they can pick off their enemies and leave their allies alone. What jutsu do you know that could help you weed gardens?" Naruto, to his credit, paused and thought about it. It only took him about 20 seconds to light up in realization. "Page Bushin." Indra nodded. "Very good. And knowing how weeds can differ from food can help you survive if you're lost and don't have any rations. Every D-ranked mission is potential training. It's up to you to figure out how to use those missions to your advantage, get to know your teammates and the jutsu they're good at, then learn how to use them together for the fastest and most advantageous way of completing the mission." Well, Naruto supposed that made sense, although he still felt like Indra had shaken his entire world. And there was also one other problem. But we're not training right now, he said, and he wasn't whining, he wasn't. Indra looked around as if expecting to see someone else. Oh. Then he stood and rubbed the back of his head. Do you want to train with me? Naruto's eyes lit up and he nodded eagerly. Then he paused. Wait, how good of a ninja are you? He asked suspiciously. The man's expression turned dry again. I'm a jounin. Naruto immediately brightened again. Oh. Okay. What do we do first? The man raised an eyebrow. We stretch. The blonde groaned. But I stretched this morning. Iruka-sensei said to stretch every morning. It won't hurt you to stretch again. Naruto let out a long suffering sigh. Fine. Indra, it turned out, knew a lot about fighting. He told Naruto to take a stance and then just sighed and shook his head when he did. Naruto, where did you learn how to fight? The blonde frowned, confused. The academy. Who taught you, specifically? Mizuki-sen. Oh. Right, Indra replied, still shaking his head. Make 100 kage bushin. We're going to get these bad habits taken care of by the end of the week. Naruto frowned in confusion again. Why would kage bushin help with that? Indra just blinked at him for several seconds. Then his face screwed up like Naruto had said something that outright pained him. Okay, make 1 kage bushin for now and I'll show you. Shrugging, Naruto did as he was told. Then Indra took the kage bushin to the other side of the training area and whispered something to him. The kage bushin looked affronted, but then Indra's hand whipped out so fast Naruto could barely follow it and the bushin vanished in a puff of smoke. After a few seconds, the original Naruto looked affronted. Oi. You take that back. Ramen is the food of the gods. Indra just stood there, one hand on his hip as he stared at Naruto. How did you know what I said? He finally asked. Well, you said, then it clicked. Oh. Oh. The older ninja nodded sagely. Whatever your kage bushin learns, you learn. So what do you mean take care of bad habits? Make 100 kage bushin and I'll show you. He proceeded to make every single Naruto take the correct stance, then go through the most basic kata in existence 3 times before he had them all dispel. The blonde blinked as all the information came back to him. How had he not noticed that before? Do the kata again, Indra said. Naruto nodded and went into the stance. It felt far better and more fluid than it had before. Better. Do it 3 times, then make 100 clones and do it again. Why just 3 times, Indra-san? He asked. Why not go for longer? Because we have to go slowly at first to make sure your instinct is to do it the correct way and I have to double check that. By the end of today, you will know the first academy kata very, very well. Naruto thought about that. Oh, he finally said, then nodded. Okay, Indra-nai. Thanks. It was hilarious to see the older man stutter. At the end of the day, Naruto sparred his new friend. It was amazing how much more easily he could move now that he knew the right forms. He still wanted to fall back into old habits though, so Indra told him he had to go through that kata with 10 clones every morning. Naruto sighed, but agreed. Then they stretched some more and Naruto went off to Ichiraku's. He had enough for 2 whole bowls tonight. It wasn't as much as he wanted, but it wasn't bad either. He went to bed feeling far better about the day than he had after he met Kakashi-sensei and Sakura that morning. Hiruzen managed to get some sleep that night despite having even more paperwork than usual and hoped that life had settled down a little into something more normal for Konoha. Yeah, no. That very much ended when Yamanaka and Noichi stormed into the room looking about ready to tear the entire Hokage tower down around him. Hokage-sama, he said, obviously restraining himself and making sure to act politely, albeit barely. Why was Uchiha Sasuke never given mandatory mind healing sessions before? Especially after the massacre. Hiruzen blinked. Because what? That had been news to him. After something as traumatic as losing one's family, therapy was mandatory, especially for children. Frowning, he took the folder in Inoichi's hand and flipped it open. It seemed he was indeed correct. Uchiha Sasuke's mandatory mind healing sessions had been waived off. And, of course, the person who had waived them was blacked out. Hiruzen resisted the urge to rub his forehead. With a sigh, he rose to his feet and walked to one side of the room, placing a hand on the wall. It retracted into itself and a doorway opened, revealing the Hokage's private records room. He strode through it, looking for the Uchiha file cabinet, then rifled through the folders until he came across Uchiha Sasuke's. He opened said folder to find the exact copy of the page Inoichi had just handed to him. Then, with a mutter and a small channeling of chakra, a poof of smoke appeared above where the blackout had been, revealing the information underneath. He closed his eyes, rubbed the bridge of his nose, then shut the folder and turned back around, walking back into the office and handing said folder over to Inoichi. I didn't know, he said. I thought he had. Inoichi opened the folder and looked at the name and all the new information. His stare turned stony and then he looked back up at the Hokage. Shimura, again. Hiruzen didn't bother with a response, simply taking a seat and getting back to work. Inoichi took a deep breath, apparently calming himself, before he spoke again. Why would he do that? My guess is that such an action would either support Itachi's narrative or undermine it. Support Itachi's. The interrogator paused, then took another breath. Let me guess. Shimura was behind the Uchiha massacre too, and he either blackmailed or framed Itachi. Hiruzen looked up at Inoichi and nodded tiredly. The blonde actually closed his eyes and visibly went through Yamanaka mind technique twice, if the Hokage wasn't mistaken. Eventually, the mind healer calmed down and spoke to Hiruzen, voice steady. That boy is a ticking time bomb. He is so focused on chasing after his brother, avenging his family and his utter need to be the best now, because otherwise he'll never catch up to Itachi, that I cannot approve him for active duty. At best he's a flight risk. At worst, he could snap harder than Itachi did allegedly. Hiruzen sat back, smoking his pipe again and frowning. What do you recommend? Chapter 3. Hi, Sakura-chan. A bright voice had Sakura sighing, especially when she saw no sign of Sasuke. Again. It wasn't fair. He wasn't even at the hospital anymore. And Kakashi sensei wasn't here either. For the second day in a row. Not that that was unusual, but now they didn't know whether he'd actually show up today either, and it would take at least 5 hours to figure that out, and it just seemed like so much wasted time to Sakura. She could be doing so many other things with her free time. A new shop had opened up and she'd wanted to browse it before Ino had the chance to take anything good and then claim Sakura was copying her if they happened to get the same things. She also had a new novel her mother had gotten her age-appropriate of course to read, as well as a couple of scrolls and textbooks she'd taken from the library. I don't think Kakashi sensei or Sasuke team will come today, Naruto said as he ran up to her, cutting into her thoughts and unknowingly echoing some of them. That irked her. She didn't want to be thinking like Naruto. The veins started throbbing on her forehead. So I was wondering if you wanted to train with me and my new friend, Indra. Almost immediately, her frustration and annoyance faded and she blinked at Naruto. You have a friend. Well, she hadn't quite meant for her words to sound like that, oops. Still, she didn't feel guilty enough to take it back. She'd spoken the truth after all. Naruto huffed and crossed his arms. Of course I do. Besides, Indra's awesome. He's super strong. Her question of, then why would he hang out with you? Didn't quite make it to her mouth before her blonde teammate turned and began to run off, gesturing for her to follow him. Come on, Sakura-chan. For a moment she considered, then looked around at the empty bridge and decided that her curiosity at this new friend of Naruto's would fill the time as well as anything else. 8 minutes later, she found herself huffing as she'd followed Naruto to the training fields. Her teammate had been in last place for a reason. She knew for a fact that he failed at many things, but apparently running at an insane pace was not one of those failures. Worse, he could just keep it up. What was he running on? Boy. Indra Nai. Sakura looked up and then her breath stopped in her throat, which really hurt because she hadn't quite caught it yet, causing her to cough. The man looked so much like an older Sasuke she had to do a double take. And a triple, and a quadruple. Sakura-chan. Are you okay? Naruto asked, rushing up to her and thumping her on the back. It didn't help. At all. Actually, it hurt. I'm fine, she managed to get out, brushing Naruto's hands off and away. It's just she paused and looked back at Indra, a blush rising on her cheeks. Nothing. It's nothing. If you're sure, Naruto said, not sounding like he believed her at all, but then he moved on with his normal exuberance. In any case, Indra Nai, this is my teammate, Sakura-chan. Sakura-chan, Indra Nai. Nai? She asked. They look nothing alike. Naruto sheepishly rubbed the back of his head. Well, I call Hokage Jiji, and I'd call Iruka-sensei Iruka Nai if he weren't already Iruka-sensei, so, yeah. She just blinked at Naruto for several seconds before turning a questioning gaze on the very hot man. I don't mind, the man muttered softly, looking away as a slight color came to his own cheeks. And his cuteness level went from steaming to smoking, why couldn't Sasuke do things like that? She immediately shook that thought from her head. No one was cuter than Sasuke. Full stop. A pleasure to meet you, she finally said with a polite bow. He just nodded at her stoically. Yeah, this was one of Naruto's best ideas yet. Not that he had many, but credit where credit was due. Speaking of, her teammate almost shouted happily, he really needed some volume control. I was thinking, since you helped me so much, that you could help Sakura-chan too. Wait, they hadn't discussed this before. Sakura wanted to sigh and rub the bridge of her nose, but instead she turned to the man and bowed a little. If you don't mind, she said hurriedly. He just blinked at her, then shook his head. I don't. His one onyx eye never seemed to leave her for some reason, not that she was complaining. Thank you, she said softly. He was, after all, taking time out of his day to train her teammate and now her too, apparently. Awesome. What are we doing today, Indra? Naruto asked excitedly. Honestly, if he were a puppy, his tail would wag off of his backside with those levels of excitement. You are going to create 100 clones and we'll go over the second academy kata. Sakura couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment even as Naruto nodded determinedly. She already knew all that, although her estimation of his ability to teach went up if he knew her teammate needed help with his frankly terrible forms. I did the kata this morning, like you said to, the blonde informed the man. Indra nodded once. Good. Show me. What about me? Sakura asked meekly, and if some annoyance crept in, well, who could blame her? Indra held up his hand and a clone appeared by his side. Bye it. Naruto yelled, pointing at the man accusingly. You can use the cage bushin too. The man blinked. I'm a jounin. Sakura frowned. So, every jounin can use this technique? She asked. He turned his single black eye on her. Jounin in most villages are required to have a corporeal bushin technique. Cage bushin has the most advantages, so that is the one I learned. Oh. She glanced out of the corner of her eye at Naruto, who already had 100 different corporeal bushins, each of them blushing and grinning, still sheepish, as if pleased. He already knew it so well. Huh. Well, even a broken clock had to be right twice a day, right? Still. Can I learn that? She asked hopefully. The man's expression blanked. If you tried, you would die. That hadn't been something she'd expected. I'd die. He nodded. It requires about a dozen times what your current chakra reserves are to make just one. She couldn't help her eyes widening and then turning to stare in shock at her teammate who looked rather taken aback himself. Then she looked back at Indra. A dozen? She asked. He nodded. Naruto is a natural chakra powerhouse. She had a very difficult time believing that. But then why she started, before cutting off and looking down, both embarrassed at losing control of her mouth and frustrated at the sudden realization. It's harder to control a larger amount of chakra, the man said, answering her unfinished question. Oh, was all she could say whisper really? Really? Naruto asked, also sounding surprised. She looked up through her lashes and saw Indra nodding at her blonde teammate who looked thoughtful. That's awesome. But can we go practice now? Indra smiled fondly at that. It was small, difficult to see, but definitely there. Yes. Meanwhile, my clone will help Sakura-san. He seemed to add the honorific on as a last-minute thought, and Sakura had to wonder why. That just seemed strange to her. Still, she thought it would be a weird question to ask someone who was about to help her train, so she decided not to. What will I be learning today? She asked instead. Well, first, we're going to spar so I know where you are in your katas. Then I'm teaching you to tree walk. Sakura blinked. Tree walk. It is a basic chakra control technique and you will be doing it for the rest of the day. If you want to improve your reserves enough to make a cage bushin, you'll have to drive yourself to the brink of chakra exhaustion as often as you can. The pin cat couldn't help if she blanched a little. Somehow she thought the next few days would be very difficult and wondered exactly what Naruto had gotten her into. Ibisu checked his watch for the umpteenth time before he finally decided to give up and report back to the Hokage. He should have known that Haddock's habits would have rubbed off on his newly graduated genin teammates. Whoever had decided letting that man anywhere near children had been drunk at the time. That was the only explanation. He would never voice such thoughts aloud as he knew the Hokage and elders had been behind said decision, but he still had to privately question their thought process because seriously. He also supposed he shouldn't have expected better from the demon container. Well, either way, the Hokage would hear about this. With an annoyed grumble, he stalked towards the Hokage tower. Sakura groaned as she fell into bed. Indra may be a very, very hot man, but he was also a devil in disguise, a slave driver that made Kakashi sensei look utterly tame in comparison. Once he'd initially sparred with Sakura and thoroughly wiped the floor with her, he'd informed her that while she certainly had the academy forms down, she didn't utilize them well. She was too stiff and reluctant to actually flow from form to form as she needed to. Back at the academy, the teachers had always praised her for going slowly enough to actually learn the katas, but now, apparently, she needed to learn to speed them up and he stressed this part extremely hard, actually apply them. The katas weren't just there to be learned, they were tools and bases upon which to build a style. They had a purpose and she was not utilizing them for that purpose, or so he claimed. She'd honestly thought learning and practicing them would be enough and everything else would fall into place. Apparently not. Then he'd shown her how to walk on trees with her feet and only her feet. Not run, walk. She'd been so pleased when she'd gotten the exercise down the first time and he'd even complimented her for her superior chakra control. Then he'd made her walk up and down the tree for hours until she'd lost that control and crashed to the ground out of sheer exhaustion. He'd given her a chakra pill and then told her she'd have to sleep the effects off that night. After that, they'd had lunch, some healthy greens and fruits bought by Indra, which was super nice of him, he wasn't even their official sensei. Alongside a selection of bread and meats. Sakura had initially skipped those until Indra had noticed and asked her why she did. She had to explain that she was on a diet and the look he'd given her would have made anyone cower away. What had followed was one of the harshest scoldings she'd ever heard. At least Naruto had shared a part of it, too. But Indra had outlined how not having enough food, pointed look at Sakura, or the right food, pointed look at Naruto, would stunt their growth and stop them from becoming strong ninjas. Then he'd told her blankly that if she had to be on a diet, she wasn't working hard enough to be a decent kunoichi. Reluctantly, she'd picked up some bread and meat just to stop his stare of doom so she could actually breathe again. Naruto had protested and then proceeded to bargain with Indra as to when he could have ramen. Indra had argued skillfully, seeming to know exactly what to say to get a good compromise out of the stubborn blonde. It was kind of impressive. She wondered how long the two had known each other. In the end, he'd extracted a promise from her that she would not skip the more fattening parts of her meal, while Naruto could have ramen 3 times a week. Indra even promised he'd go with the boy to buy tasty things, and then pointed out that one's favorite food tasted better when they didn't have it every single day. The blonde didn't seem to believe him, but looked to be willing to try something that would make his ramen taste even better than it did now. Sakura just shook her head the entire time. Once that had concluded, they'd cleaned up and Indra had made her go through her katas, correcting little things here and there that he said would help her move into the next form better. Then he made her spar with Naruto, and she couldn't help but be shocked at how much better her teammate had become since she'd seen him last. His forms looked solid, at least the ones he was using, and his speed had improved greatly without seeming to deplete his insane stamina. That didn't even count those times she tried to use a move that he wouldn't know if they'd only gone through the second kata and he just pulled some random move out of nowhere to completely blindside her. She lost a lot of those fights, but then Indra would make her get up and do it again. It sucked. She'd only won about a fifth of their matches, but couldn't help but be proud of those few wins. Tomorrow she would have more. She made sure to eat something sufficiently fattening on the way home before she'd stumbled inside with a tired wave to her parents. Then she'd brushed her teeth, braided her hair and practically fallen asleep on her way to flopping onto said bed. It had been a long day. Sakura woke hurting. A lot. She groaned at the bone-deep ache that seemed to circle throughout her entire body, but her alarm going off informed her that she had to get up to meet her teamer Naruto. Maybe if they were lucky, they could get Sasuke or Kakashi-sensei back. And for the first time ever, she almost wished for Kakashi-sensei over Sasuke. Because ow. Still, she made herself stretch, which did help, and then stumbled to the bathroom where she took a long, hot shower. It felt wonderful. Most of the ache had left her body by the time she made it down for breakfast. Thankfully her mom was up and had her typical salad waiting for her. Sakura took one look at it and sighed. Then she explained to her mother that as a kunoichi, she had to take in more calories. Her mother had frowned, but thankfully hadn't argued. Instead, she'd agreed to fix more in the mornings, but for today they only had rice that would be ready in time. Thankfully, her mom seasoned it so it didn't taste extremely bland, but Sakura hoped that future meals would be better. This would have to do for today, though. She thanked her mother, kissed her cheek goodbye and then left. Sadly, she only found Naruto at the bridge and he looked excited to be training again. If nothing had convinced her of his insanity until that point, that certainly did. He dragged her off towards the training grounds where they found Indra-san once again. She prepared herself for another grueling day, but he only had her go through the katas a couple of times, correcting her stance until he was convinced she'd fixed some problems that he claimed tended to crop up when increasing form speed. Then he'd had her walk up and down trees again for a couple of laps before he had her come and sit across from him. Surprised at the request, she daintily lowered herself to her knees and sat there, waiting in curiosity. Naruto said something about you liking your other teammate Sasuke. Was it just her, or did he wince at that? She clenched her teeth and her hands curled into fists as she looked back at the group of orange and yellow now fighting each other. Naruto, she hissed. It's kind of obvious, actually, Indra said dryly. Sakura harumphed quietly and turned back around, cheeks reddening. There's nothing wrong with liking someone, the man went on, but I've known several Uchiha. The pink-haired girl breathed in and looked up, eyes wide. Oh, right, he must have known many before the massacre. Do you know what an Uchiha finds most attractive in a potential partner? He asked. Sakura's eyes lit up. Oh, Sasuke likes long hair and thin waists and… No, the other man interrupted, his eye closed as if restraining himself. He took a deep breath. You could have shaved your head and belonged to the Akamichi and he'd still find you attractive if you were strong. The Uchiha chase strength. If you want to have a chance at him, then chasing after him and telling him he's the best no matter what happens is not going to help. It's only going to annoy him. Sasuke's words from earlier that week shot through her head. You're annoying. Was Indra-san right? The problem is, you can only really get strong if you also do it for yourself. And you joined the academy before you ever met Sasuke, so tell me, Sakura. Why did you want to become a ninja? It had been a long time since she thought of those days, the days before Ino and Sasuke, way back into her childhood. I wanted to be stronger, she finally answered. Indra didn't look impressed. Why? He pressed. Because her father had told her stories of these amazing, brave and strong people who were also ninjas when she'd been younger, she'd wanted nothing more than to be one of those women from those stories. But she couldn't tell Indra that. She couldn't tell anyone that. How embarrassing. What do you mean, why? She finally asked, a little put out. Why wouldn't I want to be strong? Indra pursed his lips to one side as he studied her, or, that's what she assumed the little twitch of his mouth was supposed to translate into, but she didn't know him well enough to really be sure. Then he nodded behind her. You see Naruto, over there? He asked. You don't seem to think too highly of him now, but I promise you that even if only due to the sheer amount of chakra he has, he will go places. His dream of being Hokage is not out of reach because he will not stop. Awry, if soft snort followed that as he stared at the young boy with an expression the pink cat couldn't decipher. I don't think it's in his vocabulary. Sakura felt her eyes widen in surprise and then her brow furrow in bemusement as she looked over at the loud-mouthed noisy blonde and she just couldn't see it. But then the image of all his Kage Bushin just appearing 100 of them when even one would kill her 12 times over and she had to reconsider. Your Sasuke probably wants revenge and honestly, that is not the best or most stable reason to be a ninja, but it is powerful. It will drive him to do reckless things to get the kind of power he feels he needs to exact that revenge. And you want to date a boy. Sakura felt her stomach sink in shame. When he said it like that. But she also felt that fire from her inner voice ignite. That's not all of it. She heard herself protest and then wanted to sink into the ground for shouting at her current mentor. Instead of berating her, though, he just raised his one visible eyebrow, looking skeptical. Oh? She looked away from him, down at the grass under her knees. It's hard to explain. He didn't move a muscle except to say, try. For a moment, she considered not doing so, just getting up and walking away, but then she remembered that Indra had gone out of his way to help them. To help her specifically, 2 days in a row. He was still trying to help her. So she took a deep breath and tried to put her thoughts into actions. I've always known that my family was not the type to fight. They're civilian and in the stories, ninja have to protect them. I guess I wanted to be one of those who, fought. Indra's expression fell to a deadpan. You guess. She grit her teeth again. Fine. I know I want to be one of those. One of those people who protects those they love who are strong enough to protect them. Sakura blinked. Huh. Now that she thought about it. Yes, she finally said, nodding her head firmly. Indra returned the nod, looking thoughtful again, and how he could do so without moving his facial muscles was beyond her. HN. Well, I won't lie to you, Sakura. You have very small chakra reserves. You make up for it by wielding your chakra so precisely, but I doubt you will be able to get to a point where you can create a Kage Bushin before you're 15 or 16, and that's if you work hard at increasing your reserves every single day. The more he spoke, the more Sakura felt her heart sink. Oh, she finally whispered, feeling more ashamed than ever. Why hadn't she worked harder on expanding her chakra reserves in the academy? However, there are other options. Sakura perked up and looked back up at the dark-haired man. Options? She asked. He nodded. Jinjutsu is one path you can take. It requires immense control of one's chakra and deals more with manipulating your opponent's chakra than drawing on your own. I think you could excel at it. The other that I can see is to become a healer like Lady Tsunade of the Sannin. Being a healer is far more physically demanding, though. Currently, I would recommend you choose one to focus on and you can dabble in the other as necessary. Then he fell into silence, seeming to expect her to choose. But how could she? She didn't know which would be best. She could see herself standing next to Sasuke, throwing out elaborate illusions while he shot out fireballs, but she also loved the idea of nursing him back to health. She opened her mouth to ask which path Sasuke would like more, but then realized that Indra probably wouldn't appreciate that. So she closed her mouth and tried to figure how to reword that. Which option would let me help my teammates the most? She finally said slowly. Indra smiled ever so slightly, but it still felt like a win to her. Eventually Sasuke will awaken his Sharingan. The Dojutsu can see through most Jinjutsu and can copy and cast them near perfectly. Naruto has a factor that lets him heal at a faster rate. Sakura blinked. He does. Indra shrugged and fell back into silence, staring intently at her. She swallowed and thought back on his words, a little annoyed that he hadn't answered her question, but forced herself to think through the situation. Well, if Sasuke could cast and see through Genjutsu, then her being able to do something like that to a point of focusing explicitly on it may not be such a good idea. It would give their team extra coverage in one area while leaving them open in another, especially Sasuke. Sasuke, who couldn't heal like Naruto supposedly could. I think I'd like to learn medical jutsu, she finally said slowly. And the deadpan expression came back. You think? She opened her mouth to say that of course she knew, but then she realized that she didn't know. This was the entire course of her future life. That wasn't just something she could decide on a dime. Can I do some research? She finally asked meekly, bordering on sheepish. To her surprise, Indra smiled an actual smile, not the twitches she'd been interpreting as smiles. Good answer. Sakura felt herself relax and smiled up at the man in front of her. She always loved giving the right answer. Take the rest of the day. Go to the library and do research. This is an important decision. The Pincat nodded firmly, then rose to her feet before bowing lowly. Thank you for your help and guidance again today, Indra-san. He just smiled again, nodded and said nothing but HN. Chapter 4. Kakashi didn't know what he was still doing in T&I. Or, well, he did kind of. That uncertainty was what really got to him, though. He was a former Anbu captain and an elite jounin with multiple pages and multiple bingo books from multiple countries, and he'd kind of gotten used to, well, if not being in control of a situation, having the abilities and clout to sway those outcomes at least a little. So being more or less tied to a chair with chakra suppressors strapped to his wrists and ankles for what had to be the third day in a row when he was positive he'd been cleared of any wrongdoing was worrisome. At least the chakra suppressors stopped Obito's eye from draining him as badly as it often tended to when not covered. There was probably some sort of treatment option in that if he ever trusted a medic enough to tell them. He wouldn't. They would keep him in the hospital and that was not worth it. It didn't help that Yamanaka-san, his primary interrogator, had begun to ask very personal questions and Kakashi hoped that he'd be able to get some answers at least today or released. He'd take either at this point. As if he'd been called by Kakashi's stray thought, the current Yamanaka clan head strode into the room with a grim expression on his face. My apologies, Kakashi-san, he said, sounding completely sincere. Kakashi gave it 60-40 odds against that the man was actually honest and said expression. I know this hasn't been ideal for either of us, but we had to get some things out of the way, especially with our recent look into some of Shimura-san's records. He paused, but had said that last part with a completely blank face. Well, fudge. Kakashi wasn't sure he wanted to know what they'd found if the T&I specialist had this kind of reaction for someone he was interrogating, and Kakashi changed his initial assessment of 60-40 against to 70-30 for sincerity instead. The blonde man sighed and sat down in his chair, the comfortable one situated across from Kakashi's hard metal one that had long since made many parts of his body go numb. Then, to his surprise, the man seemed to take Kakashi's current state in and sighed even more deeply before standing up and walking over to a wall, channeling some chakra through something. Kakashi couldn't even sense the pattern that must have been required due to the chakra suppressants. Then, to his surprise, the wall slid aside. Behind it, Kakashi noted several pieces of information gathering equipment ranging from tables and multiple chairs, all stacked together to torture implements. He couldn't help if he tensed when Inoichi reached inside and couldn't bring himself to completely relax again when the interrogator brought out what looked like a very comfortable chair. Then the blonde closed the wall behind him and set the chair down next to Kakashi. He then proceeded to untie the jounin, much to the silver-haired man's surprise. The interrogation is not finished, but you have been cleared of all wrongdoing in this matter, the blonde man said tiredly. I am untying you because I am positive you have the intelligence to not run, no matter the questions I ask. This is still an ongoing investigation. He still didn't take off the chakra suppressors. Message received loud and clear. Of course, Kakashi said, smiling with his eyes and mouth as he rubbed his wrists and stood to take the offered comfort. Now if only they'd give his mask back, he could pretend things were even somewhat normal. Inoichi settled back into his chair and glanced at the folder he'd brought in with an almost forlorn expression before fixing his eyes back on Kakashi. What I am about to tell you is an A-rank secret and it won't be pleasant for you to hear. Well, he'd been through difficult before. Still, Kakashi couldn't help but be wary at the ominous statement. Inoichi took a breath, seeming to steel himself before speaking. Shimura-san seems to have wanted the position of Hokage for a while now, likely since Andame-sama was given the position. Kakashi allowed himself to frown at that as he sat down. It wasn't exactly something anyone in the know didn't understand. However, Danzo hadn't had the political support to take over after Minato-sensei after the Nine Tails attack, and likely still didn't, even if that support had been slowly growing in his favor. This morning, our Anbu found his personal record room. I suppose his paranoia over misremembering details overruled his paranoia at being caught because they were very much intact despite having been rigged to incineration. The trap hadn't been set off, though. Inoichi's eyes narrowed suspiciously at that, but he must have dismissed it for later because he continued. According to them, Shimura-san wanted the Hokage's position badly enough that he was actively undermining the other Hokage candidates, up to and including the Sannin. Kakashi felt ice begin to build in his stomach as Inoichi opened the far too thick folder, pulling out another folder, one of about 8, and opening it. According to this, he has let information slip to multiple opposing forces since the Second Shinobi War. We currently have documentation of information given to all of the other 4 elemental nations, bandits, missing nins including Orochimaru and even minor elemental nations, with the goal of, in his words, highlighting Hiruzen's weak leadership. In reality, it makes a very strong case for treason. It's disturbing because he claims to love Konoha, and honestly, I believe him, but he hates seeing that weakness leading and consciously actively even undermine Konoha in a twisted attempt to fix the situation, making the village weaker so he could take the Hokage's hat. The Yamanaka shook his head and put the folder back inside the larger folder. The Hokage and I both thought you ought to know that one of the incidences he had a hand in was the one at the Kanabi Bridge. He notated how he hoped that by killing his students, he could drive the 4th away from the Hokage's seat due to grief as he carried on Hiruzen's weakness. Kakashi had known it was coming with everything Inoichi had said, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. Or 100. From Guy. That horrible mission that had gone so wrong. That had been a setup all along. By his own village. No, by the village Danzo wanted to create. What, did he want Konoha to become another mist? Simply to support his idea of strength. And he had to kill off Obito to do it. Kakashi started, but then had to pause and swallow, hating that he'd shown even that weakness. Then he continued as deadpan as he could. What about the incident with the 3 tails? He asked. Inoichi shook his head. We haven't gone through everything yet, so we don't know, but we are not finding any documentation. Currently, I have to say that if it was a setup, it wasn't from anyone inside of Konoha. Kakashi honestly didn't know whether that made the events that had happened regarding Rin worse or better. And now for the really unpleasant part, Inoichi continued, sounding gentle. I need you to tell me what happened at the Kanabi Bridge again, Kakashi. I've read the reports from all survivors, but we need to go over it for some clarification and to make sure Shimura hasn't doctored anything. The silver-haired Jounin's mouth went dry and he felt his insides clench. He did not want to talk about it. At all. But it was his duty. And he couldn't breathe. Why couldn't he breathe? Normally in a position like this, he would Chidori someone or multiple someones and then run away to hide and regroup. He didn't exactly have that option at the moment, which just made it all worse and… Okay, Kakashi, Inoichi was suddenly in front of him, when had he gotten there? I need you to breathe with me. He reached for Kakashi's shoulder, slowly so as not to startle him, he appreciated it more than he cared to admit, even to himself, then began to count. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 8. Repeat. It helped. After several minutes that each felt like years, Kakashi could finally breathe on his own again. Inoichi smiled once he saw his fellow ninja was stable and horribly embarrassed again. Then he sighed and rose to his feet. I looked at your file. You had your mind healing waived after both incidents. It wasn't a question, but had been pointed enough that he answered anyway. I don't need it, Kakashi said, although the words rang hollow. He'd always needed it, he just didn't deserve it. Not after everything he'd done or not been able to do, as the case may be. That, and he hated the idea. He despised being vulnerable. Kind of like he was now. All ninja needed, Inoichi replied, sounding exasperated. No, Kakashi shook his head. I'm fine. Clearly, the blonde replied sardonically. Kakashi winced. That revelation of Shimura's involvement had shaken him badly. Really badly if he had lost this much control. He needed to get himself together. And maybe go kill something. Or many somethings. Like Shimura Danzo and his flunkies. Then the Yamanaka sighed. Kakashi, I can tell you want revenge. I don't blame you, but you can't. We still need to interrogate Shimura at the least. I cannot release you until I feel you aren't a danger to this village or yourself. Kakashi let out a harsh laugh. Funny, no one had cared whether he was a danger to himself or not in Ambu. Kakashi, Inoichi said quietly, and really, that tone was what drew his attention more than anything. It hadn't been loud or demanding, but soft. Not pleading either, just informing. Shimura Danzo has caused this village enough damage. Please don't add on to it by hurting one of our best Jounin or any of Konoha's future ninjas. Danzo will get his comeuppance. I promise. Too bad Kakashi couldn't seem to trust anyone's promises right now. Inoichi must have recognized the expression in Kakashi's eyes because he sighed. I'll get a setup for you here. We have some very comfortable rooms. But until you at least agree to attempt to work through this, I cannot, in good conscience, release you. You can come to me or anyone with enough clearance whenever you're ready, and we'll even consider this a paid assignment, but you will be remaining here for now." Heart of Kakashi wanted to scream and yell in rage, but without chakra, he wouldn't be able to do much against another jounin in their stronghold. He made sure to hold it all back behind his mask through sheer force of will. For the first time in a very long time, it hurt to do so. Once he trusted himself enough to respond, he simply nodded but remained silent. Eventually, Inoichi sighed and nodded to the door. "We will escort you to your temporary rooms. Please rest or train or do whatever you have to. There will be access to an inside training room, even though I don't think it's a good idea to release the chakra suppressors or allow access to anything particularly sharp. Take that as you will. Don't forget that you will be watched while here." This was not a good idea. At all. This would end in either Kakashi's destruction or the facilities. He wasn't sure which he preferred at the moment. He still nodded and rose. "Although, I did get permission to return these to you," Inoichi said, withdrawing Kakashi's hip pouch from somewhere. The silver-haired man frowned for a moment. He wouldn't be allowed near anything sharp but wait. He couldn't help it if he looked hopefully at the man in front of him. Could he have? Gingerly, he reached out and took the hip pouch, then opened it. Instead of multiple kunai, shuriken, exploding tags and ninja wire, he found a series of books. Instantly, his relief caused him to slump a little as he clutched the pouch to his chest. He had his icha. Perhaps they could all get through this without severe destruction one way or the other after all. And he'd really need to reconsider his deflection of reading the stupid books in public if he really had grown this attached to them. Jiraiya waited for the best moment to slip in through his sensei's office window to make himself known. A ninja team had just left with an assignment and the third sat back in his seat, taking a long breath of his pipe. Perfect. He shined just to the windowsill where he sat with an amused expression as his sensei stiffened. Point 1 for Jiraiya. 0 for Hiruzen. It never got old. Ever since he'd learned to do it, at least. "Seriously, sensei, do you have any idea how angry the toads are about the monkeys shedding all over Ma's chair when they came to deliver your message? This had better be good. I'm going to be running interference for months." Hiruzen didn't react. That wasn't good. No pity laugh, no eye roll, no annoyance or fond exasperation or warm welcome or even a thrown kunai. Just a sort of resigned air. Jiraiya hid a frown at how just plain old his sensei looked. The man who trained him, who had always been such a pillar of strength both for his teammates and Konoha, looked like he'd just shrunk in on himself. It was hard to admit that he lacked even a fraction of the presence Jiraiya remembered. The third Hokage sighed. "Follow me, Jiraiya, I need you to verify some information we recently uncovered." The old man stiffly rose and made his way to one of his secure file rooms. Jiraiya, caught off guard by the lack of any of his sensei's usual reactions, didn't immediately question the situation. At least aloud. They came to a file room and Jiraiya saw 5 full cabinets. Well, that's not good either, the spymaster thought. He recognized files that used seals to save space. There should be 10 times as many records than the actual size indicated. He was also already pretty sure he'd never seen these files before. "What's this about, sensei?" Sarutobi inhaled slowly before letting a thin, protracted breath out. "I found out recently that an old friend, who I thought loved the village, has been stabbing me in the back, not just personally, but the village as a whole as well." "You finally got solid dirt on Danzo?" Jiraiya asked with a mix of eagerness and incredulity. Sarutobi sighed again and looked to the side. The Sannin could count on one hand the times his sensei wouldn't meet his eyes. One of them had been just after the Kyuubi attack. He was attacked by a still unknown assailant and left at the hospital. There, due to multiple strange circumstances, we found that he had multiple Sharingans implanted into his body, along with what has been tentatively identified as Senju Hashirama's modified cells. That started a chain of events that led to Anbu raiding his residences for information. The aged Hokage locked eyes with the only student who hadn't abandoned him and the village. "I need you to go through and verify as much of the information as you can. This is all currently classified as an S-rank secret, seeing as you are going through everything we have, and no one is to know without my express permission." Jiraiya felt a chunk of ice form in his gut in anticipation of what he'd find in those records, but he nodded firmly, all joviality gone. "Yes, Hokage-sama," he said, annoyed that his voice came out fainter than he would have liked. Then he got to work. Jiraiya wanted a drink, or 10. Or 100. Or maybe the entire bar. He'd known Shimura Danzo since boyhood. He had been that creepy uncle who you tolerated because he was family but never wanted to talk to. Unfortunately, he'd gotten worse as Jiraiya had grown and risen through the ranks. He knew the man didn't follow or even believe in the will of fire like the Hokages did, but Jiraiya had never realized how low the older man had fallen. Murders, kidnapping, blackmail, extortion, and propaganda campaigns were all pretty much normal for ninjas, albeit not to this extent and most certainly not to his own village. That didn't even take into account the secret experimentations on civilians and ninja alike, the undermining of entire clans, or the unauthorized alliances, all in pursuit of the Hokage position, and that just scratched the surface. The Toad Sage had come across so many betrayals of the village and the ideals it had been built on that he'd grown a little numb and just wanted to forget about it all for a while. The Toad Sannin didn't know if he should rage, vomit, cry, or just get blindingly drunk, he was leaning heavily towards the latter. So many friends he'd lost to that man's manipulations, not to mention the friends of friends that had suffered as well. Jiraiya noticed that his notes had grown more and more terse as he'd gone on, and while he'd tried to keep them brief, he still had pages. Pages that painted a very clear picture. He glanced at a note specifically that came from an incident during the Second Shinobi War. A note regarding two shinobi who loved their village and had died because of the twisted love of another shinobi. Senju Nawaki and Dan. Jiraiya closed his eyes as he pinched the bridge of his nose. Tsunade needed to know. Now to convince his sensei of that. 12-year-old Uchiha Sasuke scowled as he calmly strolled, he didn't stomp or storm or do anything angrily no matter what the civilians who smartly got out of his path said to the bridge to meet his teammates. It had been 2 days of utter torture. He'd say 3, but he didn't remember much from that first day after he'd found that arm on his front porch. He didn't shudder, but he did push the thought to the side and redoubled his walking. He may or may not have looked even angrier every time he banished said thought from his mind, which happened a lot more than he would have liked. Then came 2 whole days of talking with Ino's father. Ino, whom he utterly despised. Not as much as his stupid teammates, but she was pretty high up on the list of people he would very much not like to meet ever again. Her dad wasn't as annoying, but he'd made the list too because he'd stopped Sasuke from taking missions, because he was mentally unstable or some other crap that stopped him from getting stronger, and that was unforgivable. Sasuke was not mentally unstable. He just had his goals. What was wrong with that? Nothing. That was what. Who wouldn't want to get revenge on the man who had killed his entire family and mentally tortured him? Why should he want to give that up? He shouldn't. Then the blonde man had had the audacity to say that Sasuke didn't have to walk this path alone. That Itachi was a missing nin from Konoha and they'd back him up. Well, okay, that hadn't been a terrible offer, but it had been an inconsiderate one because Sasuke wanted to kill Itachi himself. He didn't want to leave it to a team. He wanted to see that man's eyes as they slowly went slack from death, realizing that his younger brother had overtaken him. He wanted to watch as those eyes lost their Sharingan and didn't focus and. "Boy, team, what's wrong with you?" The loud voice broke him out of his thoughts, and he looked up to see the red bridge where he remembered he'd been instructed by Kakashi sensei to meet his teammates in the morning. It stood empty except for the orange-clad eyesore that had been nothing but a thorn in his side for so long. "Nothing's wrong," he spat back. Instead of getting the typical angry response he expected from the blonde, Naruto just looked at him with an expression that stopped somewhere between pouting and serious, eyes almost closed and making him look very fox-like with those whisker marks. What was even up with those? "Then why are you crying?" Naruto asked, cocking his head to one side as if he was watching something he couldn't quite understand. Sasuke felt his eyes widen and reached a hand up to brush his cheeks. His fingers came away wet. He mentally cursed, using every word he knew to describe his utter fury, panic, not that he'd admit that aloud, at the realization. What should he say now? "Shut up, dope. I'm not crying." "You so are." Naruto shot back. "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." "Shut up." "I'm not." "You shut up." "You are." Ahem, a new voice broke through their argument and Sasuke realized they weren't alone. Sakura had come up next to Sasuke, looking very uncomfortable. "Morning, Sasuke-kun," she said with that bright smile. "Boy. What about me?" Naruto yelled. Sakura frowned and glanced over at him. Sasuke expected a harsh jab or something mean, but instead she seemed to deflate a little and said, "Good morning, Naruto." The blonde looked just about as surprised as Sasuke felt, but unfortunately recovered faster. "Good morning, Sakura-chan." The pinkette sighed. Then she looked hesitantly back at Sasuke. Are you feeling better, Sasuke-kun?" "No." But he didn't really want to say that, so just settled for grunting "HN." She must have mistaken that for a yes because she smiled. "I'm glad." He rolled his eyes. "Well, let's go meet Indra then." Naruto cheered and turned to walk off the bridge. Sasuke blinked. "Who?" he asked. "Oh, since Kakashi sensei had something come up, we've been training with someone else," Sakura explained. That was strange. He didn't know Kakashi sensei wouldn't be there. Why? What had happened? And why wouldn't anyone tell him anything? He once again sent a mental curse to Ino's father, who said he wouldn't be able to tell Sasuke everything until he deemed Sasuke could mentally handle it. He could handle it. Yeah. Come on. He's totally awesome. Naruto said from the path, urging his teammates along. Sasuke looked over at Sakura with one raised eyebrow. He'd only have today to train as tomorrow he'd have to meet Ino's father again, as much as he didn't want to. She looked a little sheepish. He is a very good teacher. He's helped both me and Naruto a lot. I'm sure he can help you too, Sasuke-kun. And not that you she faded off, looking conflicted. Sasuke didn't really care what sycophantic thing she'd been about to say. Whatever, he muttered. He may as well see who this guy they were talking about was. Of course, just because the guy could help his two teammates didn't mean he could help Sasuke, who was leagues ahead of both of them. So he began to stalk after Naruto. If the guy wasn't all that great, he could go off and train by himself. Sakura eeped when she realized he wasn't there and ran after him, falling into step beside him annoyingly enough. I think you like Indra-san, she said. Why does Naruto call him brother? Sasuke asked. He's an orphan. Like Sasuke? Sakura flinched a little. Oh because he's been helping us, I guess. It's Naruto. I don't really understand him. Fair enough. HN, Sasuke responded. Anyway, he looks a lot like you, actually, Sasuke-kun. That caused the Uchiha to stop in his tracks and he turned wary eyes on Sakura. Wait. What? Chapter 5. 24-year-old Uchiha Sasuke smirked as he saw Naruto and the younger Sasuke of this time racing towards the training field. He could also see Sakura trailing behind them, trying her best to keep up. Maybe he should introduce her to Guy and Lee. It was a thought, but was that something Kakashi would do? He hadn't the first time, after all, and yet the sheer torture but learning possibilities. He'd have to think on it. For now, well, he'd known this confrontation was coming and had been going through different scenarios as to what he would say to his younger self. He'd kept coming back to the thought, what would sensei do? And that had given him many options he hadn't really considered before. Part of him wanted to test out the 1,000 years of pain on the younger Sasuke, but even he couldn't bring himself to quite go that far, but nothing else seemed good enough. So, for now, he decided to just play it by ear. There. I win. Naruto said, panting heavily. In your dreams, younger Sasuke shot back. Future Sasuke, he'd have to think of himself as Indra to keep the two of them separate, just shook his head. He really had been such an idiot back then. Deciding that now was as good a time as any to show himself, he appeared in the center of the training ground with a shunshin and began to stride towards them. After a few seconds, Naruto saw him and immediately his eyes lit up, and wasn't that a good feeling? Even his friend from the future didn't seem that happy to see him. Indra Nai. That would never not be strange. But it would never not be unwelcome either. Naruto, he responded, fondly exasperated. Younger Sasuke's, no, he was not giving up his name to that, so brat. Too endearing. Urchin. Better inexperienced troglodyte. Accurate but too long. He'd just go with urchin for now, eyes had suddenly grown large. Why you, he said, starting soft then growing to a shout by the end of the word and sounded far more like he was imitating a ghost of some kind than anything. Indra raised his one visible eyebrow. Sasuke-kun, he decided to say, eye smiling. May as well play off his family for now. It was what Kakashi would do in his position and he'd decided to do this the Kakashi way after all. For the most part. It's nice to finally meet you. Why you're an Uchiha. The younger boy claimed. Well, that made this a little easier, actually. Indra nodded. I was on a long-term mission for the village. I only recently got back. The urchin looked dumbfounded. Okay, this was a little fun, he had to admit. That look was utterly priceless. Naruto glanced between them, confused. Uchiha. Like you, team? The blonde asked. The urchin didn't answer him, causing Naruto to scowl. Instead, the younger brunette glared up at his older counterpart, who decided to answer the blonde. Yes. Sasuke and I are related, the older Uchiha confirmed. Behind them, Sakura gasped and began to cough again. That was the second time that had happened to her. She really needed to gain more stamina. Did you leave before or after his younger self faded off? Wow, Indra knew he'd been screwed up as a kid. He hadn't realized just how bad it had been. I heard about the massacre before, he finally replied. The urchin flinched while Naruto looked taken aback and horrified, even as he rushed to Sakura's side. The what? Naruto asked. Indra let out a long breath and met eyes with a still gasping Sakura. Could you explain it to him, Sakura-san? The younger version of his wife nodded and grabbed Naruto's arm to drag him away, thankfully getting the subtext. Why did you leave me alone? The remaining boy asked, sounding genuinely hurt. Indra sighed. Mainly because I only got back a couple of days ago and you were in the hospital. All technically true. The boy looked away. They should have told me. Oh, that needed to be nipped in the bud. You'd never even met me before. The urchin scowled, not wanting to admit the older Uchiha may have possibly had any good reason to stay away. I'm sorry you've been so alone, Indra heard himself saying, voice softer than he'd intended. The urchin scoffed. I'm fine. I don't need you. The older Uchiha sighed. It doesn't work, he finally decided on. What doesn't? Sasuke asked, surprised and still petulant. Spouting a lie until it's true. Especially in this case, it never comes true just because you say it. The younger Uchiha's eyes narrowed as he glared up yet again. And what would you know? I know because I used to be just like you. Literally. Sasuke's face had turned a rather interesting shade of red-purple and he looked about ready to explode. You know nothing about me. Indra found it particularly difficult, almost physically painful, holding back his bark of laughter and utter contempt. Once he trusted himself to speak, he shook his head. Yes, because no one has gone through anything in this world quite as painfully as you have, and that gives you a lease on life. Everyone obviously owes you everything. My apologies, Uchiha-sama. He may have sounded a little too sarcastic there. The boy looked taken aback again. What? He asked. No. That's not what I. But it is. Everyone has given you everything for as long as you can remember, because you're the last loyal Uchiha. You both depend on it and despise it because you think it makes you weak. So you refuse to openly rely on anyone as a ninja because that must make you weak too. You are nothing but a contemptuous brat who will never reach your goals as long as you have that outlook. Trusting in your teammates makes you stronger. Trying to do everything alone makes you weaker. Yes, terrible things have happened to you, but you don't realize exactly how easy you have it. You think that your life is the absolute worst and no one can ever have anything worse than you. You invalidate everyone else's pain simply because it isn't the same as yours. No one else lost their family to the one person they trusted the most. Sasuke yelled. I did, the time traveler said bluntly. That stopped Sasuke short. What? He asked. Indra sighed. An old man my brother answered to pushed him so hard he broke. He killed my parents in front of me. Only later did I find out that my parents were planning to betray the village. The old man wanted my life too, but my brother refused. However, he could tell me none of this under pain of death for both of us. For years, I hated him, but he did the best he could do under the circumstances, even if he didn't go about it well. He turned and looked into the distance, the world around him fading as he remembered his past. I got my revenge on both of them. I killed them, thinking it would finally satisfy my hatred and anger, that it would right everything that went wrong. It didn't. He blinked, realizing where and when he was once again before he turned and looked at his younger self, who seemed both mesmerized and horrified, hopeful but devastated at the same time. All vengeance ever did was take away my chances to find happiness again. That's just you, the urchin said, weakly. My situation is different. It'll be different. Will it? Indra asked, cocking his head to one side. Then he realized that a couple of words wouldn't change anything. He'd rarely been susceptible to the influence of vocalizations, or he would have given in to Naruto's stubbornness far earlier. But he didn't let his disappointment show. Instead he just shrugged. I hope, for your sake, that it will be. The "but I doubt it" at the end of that sentence silently rang throughout the clearing. Sasuke. A loud yell of their shared name drew their attention as a familiar blonde came rushing back towards them, a miffed Sakura following behind. Naruto, you idiot. She half hissed, half yelled, Indra never knew exactly how she'd pulled that off. The Jinchuriki rushed up to his teammate, eyes shining in determination. I'll help you find your brother. We'll kick his butt for what he did, Dadabeo. The urchin's eyes widened for a moment, surprise, and an obviously overwhelming amount of pain practically flowed through them. Before his younger self could screw it up by refusing, the older Uchiha stepped in. Then you'll have to train your hardest, he informed them, matter-of-factly. Uchiha Itachi is an S-ranked missing nin, that means he's almost cage level. 3 jounin can take a cage level shinobi if they have the right skills and good enough teamwork. The urchin blinked, his mind having problems processing everything. Th3? He asked. Of course, Sasuke-kun. Sakura said as she stepped up to them. I'll definitely help you. But the younger Uchiha started. His older self cut him off. You're all genin level right now. You cannot comprehend the differences in your power gap, but if you all work hard enough, you can all make jounin within 2 years. The urchin frowned. Even them? He asked Indra, thumbing in his teammate's direction. Hey. Naruto protested while Sakura looked utterly heartbroken. Indra frowned, eyes narrowing. Growth for a ninja depends on 4 things. Direction, dedication, experience and instruction, he said as his expression turned stony. Sasuke, you have had all of these. Is it any wonder you were ahead in the academy? Sakura lacked 3 of them, but at least 2 of those are easily remedied. Naruto lacked 2. Instead of a loud angry disagreement, Naruto just grit his teeth as his hands balled into fists and he looked away. I've decided on my direction, Sakura spoke up. I do want to become a medic nin, and I'll study hard to get there, Sasuke-kun, so I can heal you when I have to. Then, surprisingly, she turned to her blonde teammate. You too, Naruto. It'll be my job to keep you alive. The blonde looked particularly surprised at that. Sakura-chan, he said, close to tears. Unfortunately that means I'm off the market, she said pointedly, then looked at the urchin with a sigh. No dating, not even if it means Pig wins. Helping my teammates is more important. Indra blinked in surprise, then felt his lips twitch into a small smile. Kakashi had given them positive feedback if he recalled, as few and far between as those instances were. I'm proud of you, Sakura, he said. You are now only missing experience. You will go far. Sakura looked utterly pleased as her cheeks darkened for a second, but then her smile melted into a frown as she glanced at Naruto. You said Naruto was missing too, but he had everything but experience, didn't he? With how he was always saying he'd be Hokage, no matter what anyone else said, that's both direction and steward determination, right? The older Uchiha glanced at Naruto, who shrank in on himself a little, although not in fear, but in anger like a fox getting ready to pounce. Not for the first time, Indra wondered what effects Kurama had on Naruto without either of them knowing. Naruto, can I tell them? Or would you like to? The blonde flinched and glanced up at him, then nodded and looked away again. The older Sasuke returned his nod. Naruto's instruction was sabotaged purposefully at the academy. The other two looked utterly shocked. What? That can't be. Haruka-sensei, Sakura started. It wasn't Haruka-sensei, Naruto cut her off, voice harsh and angry. It was Mizuki. No sensei. Heh, that was so like the Naruto he remembered. But Mizuki-sensei he was a traitor, Indra said. Why? His younger self asked. Everyone turned to him. Why you, of all people? Some random kid from the orphanage, you weren't even the only orphan, so why? Once again Naruto, for the barest second, resembled a cornered animal, ready to run or fight. He looked helplessly at Indra for help. Yeah, he hadn't been able to resist that expression in years. Having it come from a younger Naruto only made the effects of said expression worse. That is for Naruto to tell you. It is his secret alone, he said. Don't pester him about it, but he turned to Naruto, they deserve to know. It's up to you to decide when to tell them, but don't take too long. Eventually circumstances may force you to reveal it, whether you want to or not, and all of your team may be in danger when that happens. Naruto looked somewhere between resigned, betrayed, and utterly terrified. Then he shot that same expression at his shocked teammates. Eventually his shoulders slumped and he nodded. Then he looked back up at the older Uchiha. You know? He asked softly. Indra nodded. And you don't hate me? The older man shrugged. Why should I? That isn't you. Which was all he could really say without breaking the third's ridiculous law. Naruto looked so utterly grateful, the older Sasuke immediately decided that he'd had enough emotional talk for the day, more than enough, really. Besides, Kakashi-sensei didn't do emotional talk. Now? Training, he said as two clones appeared beside him. Sakura, I know some medical jutsu, although only the basics. I will teach you what I know, but you will need to find a better instructor. Books will help, but you cannot learn everything through books if you want to grow faster. Naruto, 100 clones. Now. Today we go through the 4th Academy Kata. Naruto groaned, but then several pops sounded and the area filled with orange. Meanwhile, Sasuke, you're with me. At least he hadn't called him the urchin aloud like Kakashi-sensei would have. Sakura winced. Good luck, Sasuke-kun. The urchin scoffed, finally back to his old self. As if I needed. That is the type of hubris that will stunt your growth as a ninja, the older one called out. Then he grinned and looked back at them over his shoulder. And I will take a page from my friend's book and beat that into your head. Even Naruto looked a little worried. Indra, you won't kill him, right? The urchin's eyebrows rose and his head whipped between Indra and Naruto, disbelieving. By the time I'm through with him, he'll wish I had. The younger Uchiha's face paled. The older's smile widened, perhaps a bit sadistically, or would it be masochistically? This would be fun. Sasuke sat at the edge of the clearing, and honestly, he only sat because Indra had been merciful enough to leave him upright. It turned out the man only had one arm, and Sasuke still couldn't even lay a finger on him. He hadn't even moved all that much and honestly made Kakashi-sensei look like a genin. Sasuke had made the mistake of actually saying that aloud. Funny you would say that. Hada Kakashi is more of a prodigy than your brother. He graduated earlier, was in the field at a younger age, made Chunin at a younger age, and Jounin at about the same time, or would have, had Itachi ever tried to become Jounin. Instead he became Anbu at age 11. That wasn't possible for Hada cause his guardian refused to let him do so. Even now, Haddock is rusty due to his own trauma and could still be considered a solid A-rank ninja bordering on S. He'd emphasized each point with a hit of some kind, ending with Sasuke down on the ground, trying desperately not to vomit. Now he understood why Sakura and Naruto had been wary of him going with Indra. The man was sadistic. Sasuke could see the satisfaction in the older Uchiha's eyes, satisfaction at beating a younger boy up like this. Real ninja don't have trauma, he managed to get out as he forced his arms to lift him up. To his utter surprise, Indra laughed. Not a little chuckle, but an outright, mocking laugh. If you believe that, you're stupider than I thought you were, he hissed before dragging Sasuke to his feet and made him take a stance. He then proceeded to beat Sasuke down again, stating that trauma was a fact of life for ninja, and the only ninja who didn't have trauma were murdering psychopaths that couldn't even be trusted by their own villages. According to him, even people like the demon from the Bloody Mist and the Konoha missing Orochimaru had their traumas buried deeply, but still there. The moment you bury your trauma so deep you cannot feel it or anything else like it is the moment you become your Itachi. Worse even, because then you would gladly murder the one you care most deeply about, and even Itachi couldn't do that. He could. He wanted me to grow strong to test his. Another mocking laugh from Indra. You really think he told you the truth that night? That there was nothing else going on? Honestly? He wants you to grow strong to test his strength? No. That excuse is so weak, I'm surprised you accept it so fully. Sasuke's already painful breathing hurt even worse when his breath caught in his throat. What are you saying? A snort. Some ninja you are. Even Naruto would be able to get that, and yet you look down on him so much. He and Sakura are better ninja than you are now, and better ninja than you ever will be if you don't change. Fine, I'm saying that no one really knows what happened that night except for Itachi and anyone else actually inside the compound from start to finish. To find out the truth, you will have to follow your sensei's advice and look underneath the underneath. Sasuke's eyes narrowed at that. How did you know he said that? Indra just stared down at him, stony mask reminding him so much of Itachi that he wanted nothing more than to utterly wipe the expression off the man's face. That's one of Haddock's favorite sayings. Anyone who has ever met him knows that. After several more seconds of painful silence, Indra sighed and rubbed the back of his head before squatting in front of Sasuke's sprawled form. Do you know why I beat you down? He asked. Sasuke didn't answer, but Indra must have read his thoughts in his eyes. Not to be sadistic or cruel. Well, that was part of it, but truthfully, this is the kind of pain you will go through on a regular basis if you wish to grow stronger quickly. There is the fast way and there is the less painful way. Both will get you somewhere, but one will get you there faster if you survive it without getting mangled. And even if you don't feel this physical pain, you will feel the mental and emotional pain. Most people find a balance between the two that they can mentally and physically handle, because most people including you and Itachi cannot handle this level of pain every single day. Find your balance and stick to it, no matter how much you want to get stronger faster. What counts is that you get stronger, not when you get stronger. Even Itachi has to reach a plateau in his growth at some point. If you take the time to do it right now, you will be surprised at how quickly you will grow in the fairly near future, even months from now. Then he dragged Sasuke up, slung him over a shoulder, much to Sasuke's protests, and sat him against a tree. I'll be back shortly, he said. And that's one thing that will get you further than both Itachi and Haddock, taking the time your body needs to rest and recover. Your body can take you farther when it's at 100%. Sasuke just snorted, but he couldn't really move, so only watched as Indra literally disappeared. Had that been a shunshin? If so, it had been one of the best shunshin Sasuke had ever seen. And now he could only lean against that tree, trying to ignore the knot in his back as he thought about everything Indra had said and done, and it just ticked him off. He was about ready to force himself to his feet when the older Uchiha returned, Sakura on his back. She took one look at her teammate and shouted, Sasuke-kun. She scrambled down and had just taken a step towards Sasuke. He wasn't sure if that would have been a positive development or not, but was leaning towards the latter when Indra stopped her. I brought you here so you could see healing in action. You can't actually practice on a live human until you pass multiple tests, one of them including a dead or dying fish, but seeing healing in action can help. Now, watch. Sasuke opened his mouth to protest he wasn't some project to be worked on. But a glare from Indra had him clapping his jaw closed. Put your hands on mine, Sakura, he said. Close your eyes and feel what my chakra does, but don't do anything yourself, understand? She nodded and did as she was told, closing her eyes. She didn't open them for several minutes as Indra proceeded to heal Sasuke. The aching in his muscles subsided, as did the pounding in his head and heaving in his chest. He trembled less, not that he'd been trembling much, and several sore areas that would have developed into bruises stopped throbbing altogether. Eventually, the older Uchiha lifted his hands from Sasuke and Sakura opened her eyes, looking utterly thrilled. That was amazing, Indra-sensei. The man seemed taken aback by the title. Sensei. She immediately backpedaled. I'm sorry. If you don't want me to, I won't. No, that's fine, he finally said, face a mix of complicated emotion. Just remember I'm not your actual sensei. She looked away at that, half pouting, half blushing. You've taught us more than our actual sensei. He sighed, looking suddenly tired. Well, you're not wrong, he muttered. Then he shook his head. Kakashi has a lot to teach you. Why did he pause after that? This guy was too suspicious. But he's so Sakura started. He's never taught a genin team before. He's taught Anbu though. And if anyone asks, you didn't hear that from me. You figured it out yourselves. He glared at them until they both nodded. Good. Then he looked down at Sasuke specifically. Do you feel better? The younger Uchiha nodded, begrudgingly. Good. Get up. We'll go again. After all, you want to get stronger, right? Sakura turned in worry to her teammate, just in time to see him pale. Chapter 6. Sasuke woke the morning after first meeting Indra with a groan. His body still felt like it would fall apart. Thankfully, he wouldn't be going to train with his teammates today. He kind of hated himself for thinking that. He needed to train to get stronger. But he also needed a day to really think about, well, everything. Not just what Indra had told him that something else had gone on that night or that Itachi had other motivations, but about what had landed him in the hospital. He hadn't even gotten a good reason as to why someone had dropped a severed arm with active Sharingan in it, or even how those Sharingan had remained active enough without a constant chakra source to keep them so. He hadn't even really come to terms with lesser issues like the fact that Sakura had a drive and a direction to go with medical jutsu, surprisingly insightful of her, or that Naruto had been sabotaged because of something about him he was keeping secret. Something big, apparently. Although what that secret could be Sasuke couldn't even begin to guess at. Unfortunately, he probably wouldn't be given a lot of time to think things through today, as he had more mandatory mind healing sessions he would have to go to. He groaned, really wanting nothing more than to stuff his head back under his pillow and pretend the day hadn't started yet. Instead, he sighed and, with monumental effort, dragged himself up. He usually took his showers in the evening, but had been too tired the night before. So he headed into the bathroom, mind already focusing on the warm water that might actually help his aching muscles. Sasuke frowned at the shogi board and wondered, for about the 20th time that day, why he was doing this instead of the mind healing sessions that had been scheduled. Then, for the same amount of times, he reminded himself that as boring and useless as this was, it had to be better than said mind healing sessions. Shikamaru, his lazy ex-classmate, yawned and leaned his head down on his arms, showing how bored he was with Sasuke as an opponent. The Uchiha grit his teeth and made the move he'd been contemplating for a little while now. Your turn, he muttered. The Nara looked up at the board, blinked, then sighed as he reached over and moved one of his pieces. I win. Sasuke had to restrain himself from flipping the table and all of its pieces over. This is so useless, he said. Shikamaru, who had begun to reset the pieces, snorted. Thought you'd be smarter than that. Oh, Sasuke asked in frustration, what is actually useful about learning to play a stupid game? The Nara looked so utterly done and annoyed as he opened his mouth, but then he paused, seemed to think about it, and shook his head. Too troublesome. Shikamaru, the boy's mother said, peeking her head in the door with a bright smile on her face. Even Sasuke could feel the warning it presented. Why don't you explain it to Sasuke-kun? Would it be more troublesome to do that or to be in charge of dishes for the next week? The younger Nara's shoulders drooped. Troublesome woman, he muttered, but then he sighed and rubbed the back of his head before fixing his annoyed gaze on Sasuke. Shogi tests your strategy. It's applicable to life in basically 3 ways. Individual, small group and large group. It's the most easily applicable to large groups because they tend to be the most limited by the amount of people they have, so they can be easier to predict. Think a contingent of manpower in a war. It is least applicable to small groups, though this depends on the group, the terrain involved and the makeup of said group. But small groups tend to be more versatile and powerful than individuals, but less mobile than a single person, and so tend to be the least predictable. Obviously this depends on the individual, but he paused when he saw Sasuke's slowly dulling expression and sighed again. In any case, shogi teaches you to think several steps ahead so you can predict the consequences of your current choices. For instance, if I move my pawn here, it opens up several options, he said as he moved one of his pawns forward 1 step. You can also tell by this move that I've started to play a defensive game based on which pawn I'm moving. Moving another piece in another way like, say, a knight can be considered more offensive but also more dangerous. How you respond to my move and how you open your game can tell me a lot about you as an opponent. If you move this piece here, he reached over and moved one of Sasuke's pawns, then I know you're a generally offensive player and I can plan accordingly because of what pieces you can move after that. There are literally thousands, if not more, of ways to play a game, and thinking through every step you can move after this can help you figure the direction of your game. You can move any one of your pawns, your knights or your rook, initially. Each one of those moves will close down some moves for yours and other pieces, and open up other options. But going through each next step can help you go through each following move, and each step after that. Do you understand? For several seconds Sasuke studied the board and the different ways that the pieces could move. He felt like he was right on the cusp of grasping what Shikamaru wanted him to. And then it clicked. It's like sparring, he said. Shikamaru blinked. What? When you spar, if you go to kick, there are only so many ways you can move after that, which will affect how you defend and what attacks you can make in 3 or 4 moves. That's what you mean by applying it to an individual, right? The other boy blinked at Sasuke, then rubbed his chin. Yeah, I guess so. Wait, so if I move this here I can move these in the future, and that's why you take so long to move sometimes, you're thinking through all the ways something can play out. Shikamaru gave him a smug smirk. So, wanna play for real this time? Sasuke shot him a grin back. HN. Only later, after he'd left the Nara residence, did he realize what the boy had said about small groups applied to what Indra had said about 3 jounin working together to take down a cage-level opponent. Oh, he muttered thoughtfully. He ruminated on that for several seconds before he shook his head and continued home. He still wasn't convinced that the dead last and the fangirl, former, would be any actual help as a team, but well maybe he'd just have to wait and see. On top of a nearby roof, Indra smiled. He wasn't sure what his younger self had had an epiphany about, but after what he'd heard about what the kid had gone through today, he had a couple of guesses. Some of them weren't so great, but most of them would be positive. They would just have to see tomorrow. So, Kakashi, how are you today? The man with the single Sharingan understood why he had no access to sharp weapons at the moment. Because if he had one, he would have buried it in the head of anyone so utterly bright this early in the morning. False or not? And again, was it even morning? He didn't have access to the outside either so he couldn't tell. He'd considered escaping. He likely could as he'd come up with almost a dozen plots at this point. Whether any of them would actually work. That was a question almost worth antagonizing T&I and the Hokage over. Almost. No matter what Inoichi said, he was not suicidal right now. Speaking of, the man in question pulled a chair up to the bed Kakashi had curled up under. He hated that was how he felt safe right now, but it wasn't exactly unusual for him to sleep on the floor with his ninkin either. The tighter space just made him feel more secure. He knew it wasn't actually safer, but whatever helped him sleep here. Right. Still, despite his rather nasty mood at being woken up, when was the last time he'd had so much sleep? It was unnatural. He plastered on a bright smile and turned his head up towards Inoichi-san. Yo. Then he shunshined out and back so he calmly sat on the edge of the bed, as if he'd been there the whole time. Inoichi raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Good. So you ask me for a list of what would need to happen for you to leave here. After speaking at length with the Hokage, we have decided that isn't an unreasonable expectation to have in this situation. Therefore, here are your 3 conditions. 1. You need to tell me or someone else here you trust about the Kanabi Bridge incident. We need to know how many discrepancies in the records there are, and having a first-hand account will help the most. Kakashi felt his throat tighten. He did not want to talk about it. He really did not want to talk about it, but if it got him out of here. 2. Inoichi continued, we will need an oath to the Hokage himself that you will not go after Shimura Danzo or any of his subordinates, family or acquaintances without express permission directly from the Hokage. He hated it, he really did, but he'd certainly seen that coming. It still made him want to attack something, even if he didn't show it. No, he made sure to keep a happy smile on his face. 3. The interrogation specialist looked hard at Kakashi, you must come and see me once a week, every week, until I say otherwise. Yeah. Not happening. Ever. Full stop. That didn't mean he couldn't say he would. He was known for being late, after all. Inoichi must have somehow, impossibly, seen that on Kakashi's face because he leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly. If you agree to this and you don't show up to 3 scheduled meetings, I cannot give you a full bill of health and you will be honorably retired. Kakashi's eye widened in shock because what? You can't do that, he said, I'm an A-rank jounin. You need me. The village needs me. The Hokage needs me. He hoped he didn't sound as unhinged as he felt because he had to convince Inoichi of this, no matter how untrue it was. Because well, he knew the truth. He knew they didn't really need him. Shinobi came and went all the time. But the idea of not being a ninja just didn't compute. He couldn't wrap his head around it. He needed to be able to go on missions and throw himself into work he was good at like assassinations. He was good at assassinations. Sitting around, unable to do anything for any time longer than a week, would drive what little sanity he still had far, far away. Besides, the idea of not being able to do anything to protect people no matter how much of a failure he was. Just no. What we need, Inoichi corrected him calmly, much to Kakashi's growing horror because he wasn't convinced, are good shinobi who we can trust to take care of themselves. You are alive by a combination of sheer will, spite and might guy, and you know it. How many difficult missions did you purposefully almost not come back from? The silver-haired Jounin didn't wince through stubbornness alone and mentally congratulated himself for it. I would never let my companions die, Kakashi hissed angrily. Funny, he hadn't shown this much emotion in years, not since before Minato-sensei. Nope. Cutting that thought off now. He needed to stop right there and continue on his argument. He doubted he could lie convincingly in the state he was. He needed to calm down, so something at least somewhat truthful. If that means I have to stay alive to help them, then fine. I will. Inoichi shook his head. That's the problem, Kakashi, it's not fine, your life shouldn't be a side note. You aren't there only to keep other people you deem more important than yourself alive. Do you honestly think your life doesn't matter? We're ninja, he said coldly. Tools for our village. Nothing more. The blonde shot him an unimpressed look. That is a basic they teach academy students to help them learn and understand what real life as a shinobi is like. I know you don't actually believe that because you aren't en route. And yes, I know Danzo approached you. We found his documentation on it. Just his name brought a cold fury to Kakashi's chest. The memory of him trying to trick Kakashi into killing the Hokage, and how could he have known that wasn't even a scratch on the iceberg Danzo had created. But Kakashi hated that he missed the mindless days he'd spent en route as a probationary member, where he didn't have to think or feel. It had been so much easier. He hadn't been there long, but there had been a reason why Danzo had thought he had Kakashi under his thumb. He'd taken to it so easily. However, his time there and Danzo's plotting against the third Hokage had taught him how dangerous that path could be. Which meant Inoichi was right, no matter how much he hated to admit it. He still refused to look away from the interrogator, refused to show any shame or weakness. He also didn't answer. Finally, Inoichi sighed and put a hand up to rub at his temple. Look, you want out of here and I want to help. So why don't we at least start on those conditions I brought up earlier? We'll go with the easiest first. I need you to promise you won't go after Danzo, his family, any of his subordinates or compatriots. We can do this in front of the Hokage later, but for now, just tell me. Can you do that? Kakashi just glared at Inoichi for several seconds because not avenging Obito and Minato-sensei felt wrong. And again, this wouldn't be the first time he did something for the village that felt wrong. You have my word, he finally forced himself to say calmly. Not even through gritted teeth. That? Inoichi prodded with a deadpan expression. That I will not go after Danzo, his family, his subordinates or his compatriots with any intention to harm or kill them. The blonde's expression didn't change for several seconds, but eventually he sat forward with a shake of his head. I see the loopholes you're leaving for yourself, Kakashi, but I'm going to trust you with this. We are investigating. We will put Danzo on trial. Everything he did will come to light. Please, trust us like I'm trusting you. I'm not a child, Kakashi said suddenly. He wanted to snap it out like a whip, but he kept himself in check. Barely. Please stop treating me like I am one. He felt so raw and open. Like his mask had been utterly stripped away. And, he supposed, for all intents and purposes, it had. His lazy, lackadaisical attitude was not something he could hide behind right now, and so he clung to the cracked facade of his Anbu persona, professional, cold, calculating and emotionless, except it wasn't working. For the first time in over a decade it wasn't working, and he didn't know how to deal with that. Inoichi just snorted softly, but to Kakashi's relief, didn't push it farther. How about the next one, then? Can you tell me what happened at Kanabi Bridge? Kakashi absolutely refused to break down again like he had before, so he kept his emotions in check, slowly regaining his Anbu facade again through sheer determination, but whatever worked. Take your time, Inoichi said. I can wait as long as you need me to. And he meant it. Kakashi didn't know whether to be grateful or resentful because he did need time, but he still hated showing this weakness. Or, well, talking about it at all. Eventually, he pushed those thoughts to the side and took a deep breath. And then another. And another. He repeated the motion until he felt calm again, and then he opened his eyes and fixed Inoichi with a blank stare. My team received a mission to destroy the Kanabi Bridge so as to disrupt the supply lines, he began, and then went through the mission with as much detail and as little inflection as he could. It still hurt a lot. Not as much as he'd feared, but more than he wanted to admit. It was still everything he could do to just continue talking. Inoichi's first interruption happened before he even got to the bridge, when they came across the Iwanin scout on the way. Kakashi had explained how he'd rushed in with his team covering him, wanting to put himself out both as bait and as the main heavy hitter. He explained his reasoning as being the bait so that he could pinpoint the location of his enemies when they tried to target him. He didn't elaborate on why he had wanted to be the main heavy hitter. He should have known that Inoichi would want more explanation on that. Why did you want your team to cover you while you went out alone? Besides being bait, I mean. Breathe in and out. Because I was arrogant, he managed to say with a completely straight face. I thought I could do it on my own. I was reckless and foolish because I wanted to show off my new jutsu. I honestly thought I was so much better than the others on my team, excluding Minato-sensei of course. 4 breaths. Just keep breathing, he thought to himself. It almost got me killed that day. If Minato-sensei hadn't saved me, I would have died. And maybe they would have gone back to Konoha and would all be alive. Inoichi paused and frowned at Kakashi, who couldn't help but tense. Had he said something wrong? Why do you sound as if you regret that he saved you? In his mind, Kakashi swore. Multiple times. He also didn't answer. Again. Inoichi's frown deepened, but he didn't push it. Yet. You got wounded, not fatally but significantly. Yes sir. Where? Kakashi pointed to his right shoulder. My teammate healed it as best she could. It wasn't perfect, but it healed enough that we wanted to continue on. We split up the next day, Minato-sensei going to the front lines, while Libido, Rin and I went for the bridge, but were ambushed. While one of the ninja attacked us from the front, another sneaked up from behind and grabbed Rin, he faded off as something occurred to him. Oh, he was so stupid. He'd always wondered why that ninja had simply knocked out and captured Rin when he should have killed her. Initially he thought it had been because they wanted to know plans and thought they could get information out of her, but she was obviously a Chunin at most, on a 3-man team of Chunins, because Kakashi had not deserved his Jounin promotion. The following conflicts had made that abundantly clear. She wouldn't have known anything, no. She'd been bait because they were the target. They and Minato-sensei. They'd been treated like a target the entire time, not a random infiltration cell there to do reconnaissance or damage. You put in your report that you assumed they wanted information. Kakashi nodded, swallowing thickly. It was the best reason I could think of for why they didn't kill her and then go after Obito and I. But that would have just been a secondary boon had it been true. They were after us from the start. They wanted us to lure Minato-sensei in. Inoichi sighed and nodded his head. It's likely that Rin was taken to be used as bait, yes. My guess is that the 2 shinobi aimed too high, wanting to take out the Yellow Flash himself. They couldn't have known when you split up, but it's likely they knew exactly who you were. Kakashi felt his fingers digging into the wood of the bed frame, but didn't care. It hurt less than some of these revelations. They thought they could either subdue or kill us if we came after her, but if we hadn't, they would have set up a trap for Minato-sensei with just her. Again, the blonde nodded. That was the conclusion we came to as well. We were blind, the silver-haired shinobi muttered. No, we were duped by someone who was very good at what he did, Inoichi said, his own voice full of anger and bitterness. He looked up at Kakashi pointedly. I'm not going to say don't feel angry towards Shimura. Actually, quite the opposite. This is his fault, his scheme. Do not blame yourself. Blame him. That is where the fault should lie. Kakashi took a deep breath and nodded. He could do that. Didn't mean he wasn't to blame for anything that happened at all, but this shed so much new light on the subject. The resulting picture wasn't pretty, and while it seemed easier to contemplate in some ways, in other ways it was just so much worse. In any case, please continue, Inoichi waved a hand through the air. The silver-haired man nodded and went on. It was easier to keep going this time, even knowing what would happen. Obito and I argued. He wanted to go after Rin. I wanted to stick to the mission. I had issues. Because of your father? Great, another sore spot. Kakashi took another calming breath. Yeah. When Inoichi didn't speak again, though, Kakashi looked up sharply. What is it? The other Jounin seemed to brace himself, not helping Kakashi calm down, and spoke. We've found evidence that a lot of the ostracizing that drove your father to commit suicide was either orchestrated or outright started by Shimura. The White Fang was a staunch supporter of the Third, and he wasn't supposed to survive the mission he'd been sent on. So Danzo did the next best thing and drove him to kill himself by blaming the start of the Third Shinobi War on him. Silence for several seconds and then the world seemed to fade out around him. Kakashi didn't remember what happened next. All he could recall later was a red haze enveloping his vision. The next thing he knew, the floor dug painfully into his cheeks and he couldn't move well. It took him a moment to realize he was being pinned down by Inoichi and at least 2 Anbu. He could sense another 3 in the general vicinity. You back with us? Inoichi asked. Kakashi tried to take stock of the situation and it took him longer than he'd like for him to really take everything in. He wasn't in his designated room, but the hallways of T&I. How had he gotten here? A sharp pain in his hand throbbing was likely a clue he had the memory of using the Chidori to punch through the walls vaguely. They were metal and more resistant to lightning than normal earth, but they were still earth and apparently that resistance could be overpowered. As could the chakra suppressors, apparently, although it left him terribly drained, he wondered how he'd made it this far without using any other jutsu. Nice to know that one of his escape methods was viable. Well, it looks like we're going to be getting you a new room, Inoichi said cheerfully. And, unfortunately, we'll have to keep the chakra suppressing cuffs on you for now. As the blonde spoke, he stood and stepped back, allowing the Anbu to drag Kakashi to his feet. Then he must have signaled for them to release their prisoner because they stepped back as well. The silver-haired Jounin turned to face Inoichi and actually winced when he saw the man had a swollen cheek that would likely form into a large bruise if he didn't get it treated. He also had an obvious very jagged tear in his must clothes, likely where Kakashi had somehow torn it. He was glad the man had sidestepped whatever Kakashi had attacked with. Funny, he'd never blacked out like that before. I think we should continue this later, Inoichi said. You need some time to cool down, and please cool down. Do not let this fester. He took a deep breath and looked Kakashi in the eye. Do not let him win. Dwelling on what Shimura has done will not help you in the long run. It will only drive your anger and hatred to new levels, and it's already detrimental and unhealthy. He set this up to gain more control. He's tried to control you. If you let him anger you that much, he will have succeeded. Kakashi just watched the other man for several seconds before he let out the breath he'd been holding and nodded. I don't need you to tell me that. The other man just snorted and returned the nod. Good. Now, let's get you to some new rooms. Inoichi groaned as he plopped down in the seat across from Shikaku at their usual table in their favorite shinobi bar. Today had been an extremely trying day. To say the least. The very least. His Nara teammate raised an eyebrow both in question and amusement. Inoichi frowned at him. Ada Kakashi is the most stubborn, self-destructive hot mess of a shinobi I've ever met. And the man's amusement went up several notches. Shut up and get me a drink, the interrogation specialist grumbled. Where's Chauza? With his wife. Date night. Right. He must be really out of it to not remember that. And Shikaku's tone did not hide that he thought the same thing. Inoichi groaned and hid his head in his arms. He was so done right now. Well, let me cheer you up a bit, then, Shikaku said. The blonde looked up at him over his arms, his own eyebrow raised in question. A glass appeared in front of Inoichi and he sighed gratefully as he went through his typical poison detection before grabbing it and slamming it back. Okay, what will cheer me up? You haven't asked about Sasuke-kun. Inoichi's face fell right back into its cowl. What makes you think I'd want to talk about the second most messed up ninja in this village who is, by the way, a genin, 12 years old and has never even been on a mission? Well, Shikaku said, I spoke with my son. According to him, no one has ever explained the benefits of group attacks in a way that Uchiha-kun really understood or in a way that stuck in any case. But once Shikamaru explained some basic tactics, Sasuke caught on surprisingly quickly. We may have actually gotten through to him. Inoichi blinked, almost unable to believe it because that had been much faster than he'd anticipated. Really? He finally said as he thought about the implications and potential there. Then we need to drive the point home. Looks like I'll be commandeering his training tomorrow. Do you know where Kurenai is? Shikaku studied his friend for a second before a slow smile spread across his face. He saw exactly what his friend had in mind. Then he nodded over towards the other side of the room where Kurenai and Asuma sat in a corner booth and were making eyes at each other. Too bad Inoichi would have to ruin their date, at least temporarily. Be right back, he said, holding up a hand for more drinks and indicating with hand signs which table set order should be delivered to. Then he stood up and made his way over, not even having to force a bright smile onto his face. Forgive me for interrupting, he said as he stopped right by the table. The other two looked up at him, Kurenai with curiosity and Asuma with a frown. The ordered drinks appeared on the table with a whoosh as the ninja behind the bar delivered them par for the course in a shinobi bar. Asuma picked up one of the drinks and sighed but accepted the peace offering nonetheless. Meanwhile, Inoichi never took his eyes off of the kunoichi at the table. Kurenai-san, would you mind if I had a word with you? Intrigued, she gestured to the seat next to Asuma and went for her own drink. Inoichi's smile widened as he took said seat and began to explain his proposition. By the time he finished, both Asuma and Kurenai looked amused. Well, I suppose I'll see you and Sasuke-kun tomorrow morning, Kurenai said with a smile. Excellent. I will stop imposing on your time, Inoichi replied and went to stand up. The other two bid him goodnight and he returned to Shikaku's table much happier than he'd been before. How's it you always know what to say to cheer me up? He asked his friend as he retook his previous seat. Shikaku shrugged and gestured to the drink he'd already ordered for Inoichi. It's a gift. Inoichi snorted, finished checking his drink for poison, and then lifted it into the air. To the little successes. I'll take what I can get at the moment. The other man chuckled as he raised his glass and clinked it against Inoichi's. Then they both downed said drinks. So, the Nara had asked, leaning forward, let me help you work out details for your little plot tomorrow. Inoichi grinned. Why not? Chapter 7. As he made his way down to his team's meeting point the next morning, Sasuke couldn't help but be a little surprised at himself. He was Uchiha Sasuke, the lone avenger. And he had reasons for it. My foolish brother, if you want to kill me, curse me. Hate me. And live a long and unsightly life. He had to get stronger. He had to kill Itachi. That was his mess to clean up and only his. At least, that's what he thought. But Inoichi-san was right in that Itachi had deprived Konoha of the strength of an entire clan. Fellow ninja, teammates and friends at least. It wasn't the same, not by a long shot, but did that truly mean Sasuke couldn't accept their help? As long as he was the one to deliver the killing blow. Run away and cling to your pitiful life. Yesterday it had seemed so much clearer, but after a night to think it through he wasn't sure anymore. About either side of the argument, to be honest. And then someday, when you have the same eyes as I do, come before me. But could he? Itachi had always been so much better than Sasuke, and everyone had known that. Itachi had known. He had to have known with how their father had treated the two of them. Sasuke had been the spare. Even at a young age, he'd known that Itachi was the heir and Sasuke would always be second best. And it was hard to think past that. He'd tried, but if he was honest with himself, he knew he always would come in behind Itachi. He could only hope for a miracle or for his supposed brother to slip up enough for him to get in a decent shot. But Itachi never slipped up. If he wanted to kill Itachi anytime soon, then he would need someone to help create openings. When he thought about it like that, it all started to make sense again. Besides, it was Itachi who wanted him to curse and hate and supposedly grow strong enough to test his brother more. And Indra-sen was right in that didn't make sense. Itachi had other ways to test himself, so why kill the entire family? And how? Sure, he'd been good, but had he honestly been that good? At 13. And if so, wasn't that just more reason for Sasuke to train with a team? Yes, he finally decided. Yes, it was. For the first time since he'd woken up an orphan at the age of 7, Sasuke felt a weight lift from his chest, a weight he hadn't even known he'd been carrying. The responsibility of avenging his clan had been something he would have happily carried with him for the rest of his life, however long that was. But that was the thing, no matter how willing he was, according to Inoichi-san and Kakashi-sensei and Indra-san and Naruto-sensei, he didn't have to. He just needed to find people who were willing to carry it with him. Maybe Itachi had grown strong secretly hating everything around him, but Sasuke didn't want to be like him. So why was he taking that man's advice? He'd never really thought about it like that before. Besides, even if he did try to go Itachi's way, and even if that was the only way to get strong in Itachi's eyes, it was painfully obvious to everyone who had ever known them that Sasuke wasn't Itachi. Perhaps it was time to stop trying to follow in his brother's footsteps. He needed to do this his way, not Itachi's. The weight on his chest seemed to lighten even more. That felt good. And for the first time ever, he was looking forward to training with his team. Well, kind of. More specifically, he wanted to discuss team tactics with Indra-san and then try for some practical application of some of the ideas he'd gotten yesterday. If he played his cards right, perhaps he could get his teammates to help him fight the older Uchiha like Kakashi-sensei had wanted them to fight him during their second Genin test. While forcing himself to work with the other two specifically didn't exactly appeal to him, he did want to implement some of the ideas he'd spoken with Shikamaru about. He'd also come up with a couple of ideas of his own the previous night before he'd gone to bed. Although he'd likely have to heavily modify them for Naruto and Sakura, now that he thought about it. They were, after all, the dead last and best paper nin of their class respectively. He had tentative hopes for Naruto now that his education wasn't being sabotaged. Seriously, who did that to a future Konoha ninja? Mizuki deserved whatever he'd gotten, but at the same time it was still Naruto. His enthusiasm plummeted whenever he thought about those two, but they would be what he had to work with, he supposed. At least for now. Maybe he should view this as a challenge. Sasuke liked the sound of that. He started going over his teammates' current skill sets and came up with nothing. No, seriously, the only thing that remotely set their team apart from the others of their class were the Dobe's Kage Bushin and Sakura's ability to answer questions correctly. That was it. Nothing else about his teammate set them apart from his other classmates in any positive way. Sasuke huffed in frustration and then shook his head. No, there had to be something that set them apart enough to be on Sasuke's the head of the class's team and not completely thrown out of the academy, although not for a lack of trying on Naruto's part. But nothing came to mind. Nothing. He frowned as he realized he needed more information. Perhaps he should hide when he got to the meeting point. He could follow them and observe their training to see what, if any, new skills the two had developed. Yes, that sounded like a viable way forward. Then he could make accurate plans and The flash of light-colored hair drew him out of his thoughts shortly after passing the midway point. Years of looking out for Ino had honed his skills in that area at least. Sasuke wasn't sure he should be thankful that he saw his classmate's father striding towards him instead, wearing a smile that set Sasuke on edge. He briefly entertained the idea of dashing away and hiding from the older ninja. If Naruto could constantly escape Anbu, then surely it shouldn't be too difficult to hide from a Jounin, right? After the initial Pawnee apprehension passed, his logical side pointed out how his last attempts against Jounin had gone. Buried to his neck and humiliated by one, repeatedly beaten to a pulp by the other. Sasuke wisely chose to wait, albeit with a guarded expression. The blonde man greeted him cordially as he strode up to the genin. "Good morning, Sasuke-kun. I just wanted to let you know that there has been a change in plans for today. You are now scheduled to train with or against, if you prefer to see it that way, I suppose teammate under Yuhi Kurenai. Follow me, please." Sasuke blinked in surprise, and the young Uchiha barely got out my team before Inoichi cut him off, his smile growing larger. That did very little to put the genin at ease. "I had Ino inform your teammates about the change, so you don't have to worry there. Now let's get going. We need to get there in the next 10 minutes. At first, Sasuke felt a pang of disappointment, small as it was marginal, really, that he wouldn't be training with his teammates today, but then he thought about the skill set of Team 9 and figured some tracking-focused exercises wouldn't be out of order, given his goal with Itachi. As annoying as the sudden change was, he could make the most of the situation. So he nodded once, firmly, and then fell into step behind the blonde Jounin. At least it wasn't more mind-healing sessions. The members of Team 8 hadn't changed much in the last few days, Sasuke noted with disappointment. From Kiba's rowdiness to Shino's stoicism to Hinata's withdrawn nature, he couldn't see how they could have possibly become anything more than what he remembered. Although, he had to admit that they also had their own skills and clan abilities that they hadn't been really allowed to use to the fullest extent in the academy. Not only did those clan techniques and abilities give them the potential to be much stronger than what he remembered, but they also made the three genins stand out when it came to their potential in tracking. Inuzukas were known for their excellent hearing and sense of smell, Aburam had the ability to control bugs and then, of course, the Hyuga's Byakugan. He actually wanted to see how well the girl could use those eyes of hers, as there hadn't been much chance to observe her techniques before. Sasuke had never heard of their sensei before she'd come in to pick them up on the day of their assignment. The woman he was introduced to seemed less jaded and more personable than either of the male Jounin Sasuke had fought within the last week. That might mean he had less likelihood of getting beaten down by her. This is the kind of pain you will go through on a regular basis if you wish to grow stronger quickly. Indra's words ran through his head and he almost found himself hoping she was stronger than she looked. Somehow, that didn't strike him as a good way of thinking. He really shouldn't want to get beat into the ground. "Hello, Uchiha-san," the Jounin sensei said with a warm smile. "I am Yuhi Kurenai. I'm sure you remember Inuzuka Kiba, Aburam Shino and Hyuga Hinata." "Hello," he said as he bowed to them. Shallowly. He would be polite, of course, but that was all he had to be. Kiba frowned. "Sensei, what's he doing here?" "It isn't unusual for a sensei to bring in other students for spars and the like," she replied patiently. "Uchiha-san was the rookie of the year, right?" Nods from all of her students, albeit Kiba's looked annoyed. Sasuke didn't roll his eyes, but it was in your thing. "Well, we're going to have him fight each of you today. Unlike in the academy, this will be a no-holds-barred fight, except for permanent maiming or worse, of course. You can use any style of taijutsu, ninjutsu, jinjutsu, whatever you wish. At first we'll try one-on-one, and then we'll see where to go from there." Ah, so that was why plans had changed at the last minute. Yuhi-san had asked for him to help train her students. Sasuke wanted to scoff. He didn't have time for things like this, but a glance back at Inoichi let him know that he wouldn't be getting out of it anytime soon. He repressed his annoyance as best he could before sighing and preparing himself. Turned out fighting each of them with no holds barred, save maiming and death, was far different than the taijutsu-only spars they'd had at the academy. Not that Sasuke hadn't known that, but knowing and experiencing were very different, it seemed. For one, they each had their own strengths, and each spar turned out differently than he'd initially thought. Kiba fought almost wildly and ferociously, his taijutsu heavily modified from the basic style the academy taught. Apparently he'd spent more time honing his clan style, the use of which was discouraged and frowned upon in the academy, something about the same basis to work from for each kid. Honestly, if Sasuke hadn't fought Naruto on a regular basis, he'd almost say Kiba's clan style was outright brawl-ish. It had little obvious structure which made it difficult to predict, but also left several openings. However, Kiba took advantage of those hits Sasuke got in, tanking them and using the resulting closeness to get in shots of his own. Maybe Naruto would benefit from learning a style like this. He definitely needed more structure than whatever he currently had. Of course, Indra had been working on that with him, but there was only so much one could learn in a couple of days. Sasuke still won that spar, but it was more difficult than he thought it could possibly be. Once Akamaru grew, they would be a formidable pair. For now, though, the Ninken couldn't fight much and served mainly as a distraction. It even worked a couple of times. The Uchiha hadn't felt that proud of a win in a long time. From the strange looks Kiba gave him when he thanked the Inuzuka for the fight, he hadn't expected Sasuke to be cordial. Which was ridiculous. He could respect strength. Hinata was next, and Sasuke couldn't keep his grin to himself. He had rarely fought her before. He knew of the clan rivalries between hers and his, but saw little point in it, especially now, and had always hated how the teachers had seemed to keep them apart. Now, though, he could go all out. He couldn't wait. Fighting the Gyuukin was definitely an experience, and he winced at the pain in his arms when he blocked incorrectly, which happened more often than he'd like to admit. The biggest problem from her was how she didn't strike confidently. Oh, she knew where her hit would likely land and would often prepare for any follow-ups she would need to give, but more than once he saw her hesitate. He knew it was likely just her nature coming through, but it still ticked him off. "Fight me for real," he said a couple of minutes into the spar. She froze, looking at him with wide, almost terrified eyes. "You're hesitating. Stop looking down on me." He knew she wasn't, but he couldn't help but feel that she was nonetheless. It reminded him of. No. No, he couldn't go there. Not right now. To her credit, she redoubled her efforts. He still utterly defeated her not a minute later. Shino, on the other hand, Shino took him by surprise. Sasuke went in for an attack and the other boy seemed to be happy to play the defense. Then, only minutes into the fight, Sasuke realized he was lower on energy than he should be. He frowned. The other boy tipped his head to one side. "You have begun to feel it. I can tell." "Why?" "Because you have slowed down." Sasuke paused at that, scowling. "What did you do?" "I had several of my bugs land on you. They have been siphoning off your chakra since our fight began. You will not have enough stamina to finish this fight." It was probably the most he'd heard the other boy say, and to be honest, Shino probably shouldn't have told him that. He had to finish this quickly. So, instead of continuing to fight with Taijutsu, he decided to go for ninjutsu, pouring a good chunk of the energy he had left into his great fireball technique. Shino dodged, fairly easily, but that was fine. Preferred even. Sasuke could only grin as the technique set the area on fire. It was enough of a distraction that when Sasuke threw shuriken at him and Shino dodged again, he didn't notice the ninja wire that wrapped around his legs and tripped him up. Shino's eyes widened in surprise and he looked down, then back at the all-too-near fire. That was exactly what Sasuke needed. He used a Kawarimi to get behind the bug user and knock him out, he was immensely glad that worked. Then he collapsed and could only watch as the fire he'd created inched closer to them. Thankfully, a large burst of water raining over the field and Sasuke and Shino put the fires out. Shino woke up with that water in his face, but he didn't seem angry at all. On the contrary, he seemed almost impressed. Sasuke wondered why. He'd been the rookie of the year for a reason. "Excellent job, everyone," Yuhi-san said with a smile as she clapped her hands. "I know some basic healing and will be looking at everyone before lunch. I know it's a little early, but you all obviously need it." So Sasuke ended up sitting next to a quiet Hinata as Kurenai looked over all of them. Once she got to Sasuke, she'd skedated some of the internal damage that had been done to his arms via Gyuukin. Sorry, Sasuke-kun," Hinata whispered quietly. He frowned at her. "Why?" he asked, utterly perplexed. "IHH hurt you," she replied, her voice even quieter. "You were supposed to." She just bit her lip and looked away, troubled. He didn't know what to say to her so he looked up at Yuhi, who just shook her head. He wasn't sure if that was her saying to drop it or that she didn't know what to do either. "I'd be more hurt if you didn't," he finally decided. Hinata blinked and looked at him in surprise. "I need to get better, stronger. I have to. If people keep going easy on me, I never will." She could take that however she wanted. He'd spoken more than enough. At least she looked thoughtful. And Yuhi's expression seemed somewhere between surprised and extremely pleased. He didn't know why. Teammate was weird. Then again, Team 7 was pretty weird too, now that he thought about it. "Alright, I hope you all brought some bentos," Yuhi said with a smile as she finished healing Sasuke. Her way of healing had felt less abrasive than Indra-san's. Her chakra had been smoother. Calmer. Brighter. None of those quite worked but were close enough, he supposed. He wondered why. "Sasuke-kun." The older woman's voice broke through his thoughts and he looked up at her. "Do you have a bento?" "Oh. Right." He shook his head. He'd been planning on buying a couple of onigiri from a nearby convenience store. "Well, it's a good thing I usually bring an extra," she said as she handed a box to him. He blinked down at it and then up at her. She seemed to expect something. "Thanks," he muttered, embarrassed. Her replying smile could have given Naruto's a run for its money when it came to pure sunshine. "You're welcome." They all tucked in, and that was when Sasuke noticed that Inoichi wasn't there anymore. "Where is Yamanaka-san?" he asked politely. "He had to leave due to his job," Yuhi answered. Sasuke nodded and went back to eating. That made sense. "Still the rookie of the year, huh?" Kiba said suddenly around the food in his mouth. Sasuke had to concentrate to not make a face. Even Naruto wasn't that bad most of the time. "Chan," he replied. The Inuzuka snorted. "Same as ever, I see." "Not everyone likes to talk all the time," Kurenai said, admonishing. "That's not necessarily a bad thing." Kiba snorted. "My mom says if you don't talk things out, it just grows inside. She says to say what's on your mind. Or to fight it out. That works too. But she says that isn't always a substitute for talking." "That doesn't mean you should say what is on your mind all the time," the brunette woman insisted. "You can give away vital information like that. Or you can hurt a teammate, bolster an enemy," she faded off pointedly. Kiba pouted and next to him, Akamaru, who had been eating a lunch of his own, yipped. "Traitor," the Inuzuka grumbled. Hinata giggled and even Yuhi's expression softened. "Fine, whatever," Kiba finally said as he went back to eating his lunch. Sasuke looked around at everyone there. They already had an easy camaraderie going that his team seemed to lack. Was this what he should be looking for in his own team? He thought back to his two teammates and had to suppress a grimace. He wasn't sure they'd ever have a camaraderie like this. He wasn't entirely sure he wanted one. And yet. They finished the rest of their lunches in relative quiet. Once they'd cleaned up, Kurenai announced the next leg of their training. "I think, since Uchiha-san won all the spars earlier today, it's only fair that the three of you fight him as a team." That took everyone back, and Sasuke felt himself pale a little. Well, if what Indra said was true, he'd be getting stronger today after all. Running from these people was impossible. Granted, he'd known that escaping a team geared for tracking would be difficult, but he thought he could maneuver enough to get to a more favorable position. Maybe split them up a bit. But no, they all moved together and did not leave blind spots for him to exploit. So he'd resorted to traps. Unfortunately, they took more time to set up than teammate allowed him. Well, traps that wouldn't be immediately noticed by one of them. He could only scramble around doing his best to avoid the members, and especially the small aburum bugs that drain chakra, while thinking of a plan. He finally went with a simple if layered trap of having a tree snap at them with some shuriken attached. This allowed the Uchiha to distract Shino enough that he was able to sneak up on the bug user again. He was so glad that it worked a second time. Hinata and Kiba reacted quickly, though, and while Kiba moved around to come at Sasuke's side, Hinata moved indirectly. A decent pincer, he approved, or he would have had he not been the target. Sasuke was forced to reposition himself to keep both in his field of vision. When the Inuzuka moved for the actual attack, Hinata immediately rushed to get Shino out the way. Then Kiba managed to put himself in between the Uchiha and his teammates. Sasuke charged Kiba in a side-to-side fashion to both keep Kiba from being able to brace himself, as well as keep an eye on Hinata behind the Inuzuka. When it looked like Hinata had sufficiently moved out of the way with Shino, Sasuke feinted along back and then to the side before speeding right at Kiba, catching the other boy just enough off guard to allow Sasuke the positioning he needed to throw Kiba down. When he moved in to properly restrain his captive, his instinct screamed at him. Sasuke jumped back just in time to avoid a Gyuuken strike to the shoulder, though it hit his wrist instead. Hinata moved much faster than she had earlier, which caught him by surprise. Unfortunately, Kiba had recovered enough to kick out and trip the Uchiha up, bringing him to the ground as well. Hinata followed up with a palm to the chest, without chakra thankfully, but it did signal his loss in the spar. He lay there looking up at the canopy above him for several seconds as his mind caught up with what had just happened. How had she done that? He'd hardly been able to even follow her movement. And why hadn't she moved like that in their one-on-one spar earlier? Sorry, Kiba-kun, he heard Hinata say. I was too slow again. That did not sound like the Kunoichi who had more or less won them the spar. Nah. You did fine, Hinata, Kiba reassured. Before he could say anything else, though, Yuhi showed up, a bright smile on her face. Well done, team. I have absolutely nothing negative to say about your tracking formation. That would have put a Chunin team to shame, let alone another Genin team. However, she continued, her smile fading away, it seems we will need to work on transitioning into your team battle positions and formations. Kiba, you were lagging behind, and that was why Sasuke could get to Shino. Shino, you need to watch out from behind. Your hive can't always warn you on time. And Hinata, well, you were the MVP of the exercise, picking up slack when you needed to, and making sure you fulfilled your role. Excellent job. Hinata's face turned bright red, and she nervously tapped her pointer fingers together. Although, we probably could work on your speed, you did everything right today. Thank you sensei. Yuhi grinned at them, then finally turned to Sasuke. You did a fine job as well, Ichiha-san. This was just the training exercise my team needed and I hope you learned something as well. Sasuke, who had just sat up, nodded at her but said nothing. Well. If you're okay with ending training for today, we could go grab a mission, the older woman suggested brightly. Instead of the excitement Sasuke expected, Kiba groaned. Not more D ranks. Oh right. He'd read about those. It had somehow slipped his mind that his team would have to do those before they got any real missions. Sasuke sighed as he rose to his feet and brushed himself off. While Yuhi-san told Kiba off, Sasuke approached Hinata. Why didn't you move like that before? He asked. She started and backed away from him, eyes on his. What? She asked. Before, in our spar, you had a hard time moving. Just now, though, I had a hard time even seeing you move. What changed? The girl's nervous finger tapping returned and she swallowed. Well you were going to hurt Kiba K-kun. You'd already heard Shino-kun. I see couldn't let that happen. Sasuke just stared at her for several seconds. You wanted to protect them? He asked slowly. The thought seemed a little foreign to him. Oh of course. Hinata said. They're my teammates. They're my teammates. Huh. And that had given her such strength. He finally said, and they fell into silence while Kiba and Shino continued to speak to their sensei about the spar and their contributions. How is Naruto-kun? Hinata whispered, her face going bright red again. Which was weird. Why would her face take on the same color that some of the girls in the class had taken on when they'd spoken to him? And then it hit him. Oh. Teammate really was weird. He's fine, Sasuke muttered. Been training a lot. Hinata's face softened into the most heartfelt smile Sasuke had ever seen. SC. I'm so glad. Sasuke replied. Before either of them could say anything else, Yuhi turned to them. Thank you again for your help, Sasuke-kun. Hinata, would you mind leading the way? The Hyuga girl nodded and she stepped forward. Goodbye, Sasuke-kun. Yeah, bye, Kiba said with a wave of his hand. Even Shino lifted a palm in farewell. He said with an acknowledging nod. Chapter 8. Kakashi hadn't been able to sleep. He'd been able to eat a little, but between the new knowledge regarding Danzo and old memories and scenarios running through his head, he'd barely been able to read his Icha. Fortunately, this wouldn't be the first time he would be running on fumes. He'd be fine for now. It usually didn't start to get truly bothersome until the end of the second day. Day 3 on no sleep was unpleasant. Day 4 sucked. His record was 6 days, although he hadn't remembered much of the last 2 days and had ended up sleeping for almost 2 more days straight in the hospital nonetheless after that. It wasn't something he wanted to repeat. He hoped he'd be able to sleep tonight. He wished he could go and see the memorial stone. That would help some. Well, it usually did. But no, he was stuck here in T&I still because they said they couldn't trust him to go out with Danzo still alive. Well, they weren't entirely wrong, but Kakashi could follow orders. If ordered not to kill the man, he wouldn't. That didn't put maiming off the table. Or pranking. Or completely and utterly humiliating him. That last one sounded so nice. Then again, he'd be required to promise to the third nonetheless to not go after Danzo or his ilk, which really left so many exploitable loopholes he could work with that. If there was anything to work with after he finally got out of here. Was he repeating himself? He could handle going on little sleep, but it had been a while. Or maybe he could ask to simply not be left out of any punitive actions against the man now that something might actually happen. Kakashi would have to commend whoever instigated the situation. They'd done it brilliantly. Then he'd kill them for getting him caught up in it all or humiliate them. He'd heard the term troll used in regards to some of his actions lately. He was fine with this. Now he just had to figure out how to make it through the next appointment he had with Inoichi-san because he realized he wouldn't be getting out of here until he fulfilled those requirements the interrogator had laid down. He'd have to retell his memories of the Kanabi Bridge and he'd already resolved to do so. That didn't mean he was looking forward to it. And he'd have to set up appointments to come back or risk losing his career as a ninja. How was he supposed to stay sane through all of this again? At least they'd given him his mask back. Haddock-san, a professional, somewhat familiar voice drew him out of his reverie. He'd been trying to read his book well he thought. It hadn't worked very well. He welcomed the distraction to the monotony of his time here. In the doorway of his cell, because that's what it was, no matter how comfortable, he saw a man in a dark blue almost generic ninja outfit with a Chunin vest and his Konoha headband stuck to a handkerchief, matching his outfit, wrapped around his head. He also wore sunglasses despite being indoors. What was Ibisu doing here? How did you instill your despicable habits onto your students before you got the chance to teach them anything? The man asked heatedly. Kakashi resented that remark. He'd taught his team about teamwork. That was the most important thing any team should know. And he'd emphasized it from his test. That had been his first lesson. The comment annoyed him enough for him to decide to play with Ibisu. It would serve the man right. Besides, he needed some entertainment. Desperately. They read porn in public. Already. I'm so proud of them. Ibisu's expression darkened. I wouldn't know, seeing as I haven't met them as a team yet. I haven't been able to even find them as individuals in the last week. Oh, Kakashi said after several seconds. Then he went back to his book. What a shame. I've waited for 2 entire hours at the spot you informed me you meet your team at. How could they all be so late? And why? Oh. He hadn't expected that to work as well as it apparently had. Huh. I just figured it out, he muttered, half to himself. Ibisu blinked behind his sunglasses at the non-sequitur. What? Kakashi smiled brightly at him. How I'm going to maintain my sanity while here. I'll be thinking of you and this moment the entire time. That didn't seem to help the special jounin at all. Good. What? What does that have to do with anything I'm telling you? Why? The man asked, exasperated. Kakashi's eye smile grew deeper. It's the little things that make life worth living. Padakuo, he'd pulled out his scary voice. He was even leaking some killing intent. How cute. If he didn't give the man a bone, he'd be there all day, and Kakashi had to see Inoichi soon. None of those reasons seemed like good enough incentive to make the special jounin go away. This was the most entertaining thing that had happened while he'd been here. Then again, he also wanted to see the look on the man's face. That was a good reason to enlighten him. I told you I meet them at 10 AM on the bridge, he said lightly. I usually tell them to meet me around 7 or 8. They must have gone off to train on their own or something. For several seconds, Ibisu just stared in open-mouthed shock. Why you? I thought you, as a special jounin, would have figured that out by now, he said thoughtfully as he turned a page he hadn't read, this time, in his book. I suppose that's why you're still just a special jounin. Then again, now you know where to improve. He shot another eye smile at the man, outright smirking underneath his mask. He was so happy to have that back. You're welcome. Oh, and Ibisu's killing intent increased. Haddock. Ibisu-san, another voice called out. Ah, there he was. Right on time. Perhaps Kakashi hadn't lost his touch after all. The special jounin turned to look down the hall, although he still kept his guard up towards the former Anbu captain. Perhaps he wasn't a lost cause. Kakashi had always kind of assumed that guy had just sort of dragged his old teammates with him on his way up to being an elite jounin, leaving them behind only once they'd all graduated from Chunin. Genma was still a special jounin too, after all. Although he got the impression that Genma wasn't a full-on jounin because he just hadn't really gotten around to being tested. He never took things seriously enough. He was certainly skilled enough, though. But part of being a jounin was the mindset. Which, clearly Ibisu didn't have. Inoichi-san, the special jounin said, almost whining. Oh, right. Choza had been his jounin sensei, which means he would have likely known Inoichi. Maybe he saw the man as a sort of uncle. That really just made this all the more amusing. What's wrong, Ibisu? Inoichi asked, sounding confused or mildly concerned, perhaps. Aw, family dynamics. The man opened his mouth to speak, but then stopped for several seconds, glanced back at Kakashi, shooting one last sense of killing intent at him before he deflated. Kakashi just beamed at him. The man knew he was beaten. He'd sound far too childish if he said anything right now. Nothing, Inoichi-san. Haddock's just being a troll again. Even though no one was looking at him, Kakashi still gave them a, who, me? Expression. Ah, Inoichi said as if that explained everything. To be fair, it kind of did. I'll see myself out, Ibisu said tiredly. Then I'll see you later, Ibisu-kun, Inoichi said, as if to comfort the man. It seemed to work a little, actually. Aw, family dynamics. Actually, Kakashi was getting a little tired of that. Not that he'd let anyone know. The last thing he needed was Inoichi catching on to something like that and bringing the whole team in just to annoy Kakashi. He would too. The special jounin nodded, shot another glare at Kakashi, then turned and left. Inoichi stood in the doorway watching the other man go. Then he turned to his patient. Care to explain what that was about? Kakashi just smiled. I gave him some information that, while being true, misled him. He didn't realize until I pointed it out to him. The blonde shot him a dry look. Then he shook his head, rolled his eyes and walked inside, unfortunately closing the door behind him. Not that Kakashi would have tried to leave right now anyway. Not when his status as an active ninja was on the line. He hated that they'd realized that was actually an effective punishment. Well, he'll have to learn eventually. Precisely, Kakashi replied with his signature eye smile. This was honestly the best he'd felt in over a week. Ninja had to take their victories where they could find them. Inoichi shook his head again, looking amused, but then he took a deep breath and sobered. Kakashi almost winced as all the joviality fled. He missed it already. So, are you ready to go over the rest of the Kanabi Bridge incident today? Kakashi got the impression that if he said no, Inoichi would leave it alone. Then again, that would keep him stuck here for another day, and, amusement or not, he wasn't sure he could take that. Sighing, the silver-haired man put his icha away. Yes. The blonde looked hopeful at his answer, but also cautious. You realize we'll have to go over it in detail to complete the report and find any discrepancies that may have found their way into the paperwork, correct? Kakashi didn't want to know how many doctored reports they'd found already. Still, he took a deep but silent breath and nodded, keeping the same smile on his face through sheer force of will. Yes. Whenever you're ready, then. We left off when Rin was kidnapped and you didn't want to go after her. Kakashi took another deep breath. Yes. Obito and I argued. He told me my father had been a hero and then said he was going after Rin, with or without me. I went to continue on the mission, but I didn't get far. He paused and closed his eyes. Only a couple of sentences in and it was already too much. But he went on. No one had ever called my father a hero before. Even after it was supposed to restore his honor. It was supposed to make amends. It didn't. Thanks to Danzo, but not just Danzo. His memory was just treated worse. And I hated thinking about him. Minato-sensei asked what I thought of my father's situation several times, but I could never answer. Why not? Ugh, he really hated to say this, but no, he still wasn't in the mindset to lie effectively. He swore silently multiple times before resigning himself to just telling the truth. It hurt too much. Losing a parent at such a young age can do that, Inoichi assured softly, but Kakashi shook his head. That's not it. Inoichi frowned slightly. Oh. I don't want to talk about it. The blonde actually scoffed, albeit warmly, at that. If that were true, you wouldn't have brought it up. Kakashi froze. He knew interrogation techniques. He knew what people would supposedly do to assuage a guilty conscience, but he didn't have a guilty conscience. Did he? Then why had he brought it up like that? I'll ask only one time, Kakashi, Inoichi sat forward, fixing him with an earnest stare. Why did talking about your father hurt? For several seconds silence reigned in the room, so thick Kakashi was having a hard time breathing again. He really shouldn't, he couldn't look weak, and yet, hadn't Inoichi already seen him at his worst? Was this a chance to finally just get rid of it all? Should he take it? He left me, he finally said, croaking the words out, words he'd buried for decades. His honor was more important than me, and I hated him for it. I couldn't see how wrong I was. His words choked off at the end, but he refused to let himself cry. No, that was an indignity he couldn't allow himself. But he could admit one final thing. I was so selfish. Story of his life. The selfish genius, friend killer Kakashi. Inoichi shook his head. No, Kakashi. Children at that age are egocentric. That is part of their brain development. Even a genius at that age wouldn't have been able to truly comprehend, and feeling that way would have been completely natural for you. But he did it to spare me, Kakashi protested. He'd come to that realization later, just around the time of the Kanabi Bridge, actually. Would you prefer to have your honor or your father back? He didn't answer because he knew which he would choose in a heartbeat, even now. I choose my father, Inoichi said, almost nonchalantly. Kakashi's head snapped up in surprise. He'd picked up on an undertone that sounded so pained. All ninjas lost people dear to them, but he couldn't help but wonder who Inoichi had lost and what kind of impact they'd had on the man's life. The interrogator saw the expression on Kakashi's face and he smiled sadly. You'd be surprised what you can do with a good support structure. Regaining trust and honor while having someone you care for and who cares for you back around to help you through it is difficult but not impossible. Compare that to having no one to support you as the price for having your honor intact. And wasn't that exactly what Kakashi had? His honor, supposedly, but not trust, because Kakashi had had to regain that as well, even as a young child. It was one reason why he'd openly despised anything but following the rules. He hated that he was a little relieved that Inoichi had picked up on it. That doesn't make you selfish, Kakashi. Yeah. He wished he could believe that. But it was nice to hear nonetheless. Inoichi must have realized he wouldn't get anywhere else today with that line of discussion because he nodded and waved his hand slowly through the air again. Continue with the report once you're ready. Kakashi nodded and swallowed, trying to get himself back under control. He really hated T&I. Had Inoichi drugged him? That would make a lot of sense. I didn't want to lose them, my teammates, he finally said. And I hated myself for it. But I'd remembered how Rin had healed me and how Obito thought my father was a hero and I turned around and went after them. I got there just in time to save Obito from an attack. The man had an incredible camouflage jutsu, even able to hide his smell. I'm convinced it was a Kekkei Genkai. In the following battle, I lost my eye when I put myself between him and our attacker and he woke his Sharingan. That was how we won against him. Obito was able to see through the technique with his Dojutsu. We patched up my eye and went into the cave where they'd taken Rin. They were trying to get information out of her when we found them. We fought the man we found in the cave and between the two of us were able to defeat him. But we didn't kill him. Kakashi shook his head at their naivety. We should have. Inoichi sighed, though he didn't respond other than to nod whether in acknowledgement or agreement, Kakashi didn't know. The silver-haired Jounin, although he didn't feel like an elite Jounin right now, continued. The jutsu the man set off was supposed to collapse the cave. We made for our way out, but a rock hit me. My covered eye made for a blind spot I didn't know how to compensate for and it was on the side of my previously hurt shoulder. Of course the idiots came back for me, he said, but he spoke fondly, if bitterly. Yeah, Inoichi had drugged him. There was no other reason for him to go off like this. But as much as it hurt it also helped somehow. And he would take that knowledge with him to the grave. Obito saw a boulder coming for me and he threw me out of the way. In my place he faded off, unable to say the next words. Take your time, Inoichi reassured him. We're in no hurry. Part of him hated the blonde for saying that. Part of him couldn't feel more grateful. After several, far too many, seconds, he was able to force himself to continue. The Jounin must have thought we were done for, but Rin and I weren't seriously hurt. However, when we looked back at Obito. And then he was no longer in the T&I department but back at the cave-in. Half of Obito's body had been crushed by the boulder. We tried to move it, we tried everything we could think of, but we didn't have the chakra reserves for techniques that would have done anything to that boulder. Rin wanted to try and heal him but. He shook his head. He gave me his eye as a present, you know, he looked up, recognizing he was back in his room at T&I with Inoichi. It had been easier to come back than it normally was. That was the only reason the Uchiha let me keep it, it had been his dying wish. Rin-san must have been a talented Kunoichi to transfer it like that in the field while it still worked, Inoichi commented. Kakashi looked away from the man and didn't answer. She hadn't been the most talented medic nin ever, but she'd been determined and well-learned. He missed her so badly. He pointedly did not think of his last memory of her alive. I could tell the ninja who had caused the cave-in was still there, so I went out to confront him with my new eye. It wasn't mature then, only 2 Tomo, but I was determined to take him out. Obito made me promise to take care of Rin. And his voice broke again. He glared at Inoichi. What did you drug me with? The man just smiled kindly. Right, T&I ugh. In any case, that was the first time I could successfully use my Chidori. Because of your Sharingan. Kakashi didn't answer for several seconds. I never thought of it as mine, he finally said softly. It's on loan from Obito. Even if I can't return it until I see him in the Pure Lands. Inoichi looked terribly sad for several seconds, but he just nodded and sat back, waiting for Kakashi to finish. Obito could tell, as could I, that reinforcements were coming. He made me promise to take Rin and go. However, before we could get her out of the cave, the reinforcements arrived. Reinforcements because they'd likely been expecting the yellow flash, not his brat students. Honestly, it made so much sense now. Why else would there be so many reinforcements? And he hated it. The cave collapsed, I took Rin and we ran. We didn't get far, though. And that was when I remembered Minato-sensei's kunai, the one he told me to throw if we got in over our heads. Kakashi chuckled mirthlessly. Maybe if I would have thrown it earlier. Maybe, Inoichi cut in. But it sounds to me like you did the best you could for the skills you had at the time. Kakashi didn't think he could believe that either. In any case, I told Rin to go. The ninja attacked. I threw the kunai and I must have blacked out from chakra exhaustion. The next thing I knew, I woke up to Minato-sensei sitting next to me. It was night. Rin and I were alive, but he faded off, shaking his head. Minato-sensei told me later he was proud of me, but I knew that losing one of his team hurt him. Of course it did, Inoichi said, his voice soft and warm. Any teacher would be. But I know he was proud of you for doing your best, for learning and for trying and for saving Rin. And that well, that he could believe. It hurt to accept because he still thought Obito should have lived instead of him, but Inoichi wasn't wrong. Yeah, he whispered. Inoichi's smile widened and he gestured for Kakashi to go on. We went back to take out the bridge, he said. In Obito's name. We managed to sneak past the enemy lines, probably because Minato-sensei had utterly obliterated them and blew the bridge up with explosive tags and jutsu. We didn't encounter any other ninja on our return. And everyone's reactions once you did return. Kakashi frowned and thought back. The Hokage had been relieved but sad. The Uchiha were well, Uchiha. They wanted me to give the eye back until the situation was explained to them. And even then he shook his head. Everyone else proclaimed us as heroes. He thought about that and felt a vindictive grin come to his face. Bet that ticks Shimura-san off, he said brightly. Inoichi snorted. Probably. They shared a smile for a couple of seconds before Kakashi's grin faded. Rin was never the same, he said. Then he snorted derisively. I suppose I wasn't either. Or Minato-sensei. He tried, but the laughter in our team was gone. Inoichi frowned. Is that why you took up your eccentricities? He asked. Being late, reading those books in public, trolling people, he shot Kakashi a pointed look and then glanced at the door where Ibisu had been not too long before. Kakashi's smile was wry and bitter. Partly. I mean, he was always so positive and passionate. I thought maybe those habits would help me be that way too. Did it? Kakashi sighed and shook his head. Inoichi said. Then, finally, he sat forward, folding his hands together and resting his elbows on his knees as he fixed his patient, with his blue gaze. First, you should probably know that I don't remember any discrepancies between your report just now and the written one. I'll have to go back and look it over once more to be sure, but I think we're in the clear as far as this mission goes. Second, if you'd like to accompany me to the Hokage Tower so you can give your word to him, I can release you, as long as you agree to come back to see me once a week when you're in the village. Kakashi still hated that. Inoichi must have seen the disgust on his face because he shook his head. Kakashi, I want you to pay attention to how you feel about your past, about your father, your team, your missions, even Danzo. See if you don't feel better about it all. And if you do, please just try. Come back here and try to do what you need to do to become healthier. I'd prefer that you do it for yourself, but if not, then in memory of your former team and for the sake of your current one. Those children need someone who can be invested in their future to help them grow into the ninja they can be, ninja that can survive. That made Kakashi want to squirm. He didn't, of course, the drug must be wearing off, but he still wanted to. He couldn't invest too much into them because what if they died? What if he got them killed too? What if he drove them to their grave? But then again, wouldn't he be doing the same if he didn't put his all into teaching them? If he only did the bare minimum like he'd been planning. Because the council wanted him to train Sasuke and he would because he'd been ordered, but while Naruto was sensei's child, he didn't want to be around the boy. And the girl, she had potential, but she was so much like Rin. Well, maybe he really did need some help. Ouch. Bad brain for even thinking that. Still. I don't have much of a choice, he muttered, remembering that if he didn't agree to that, he would be forcibly retired. Inoichi shook his head. There is always a choice. You just don't always get to choose the consequences of those choices. Kakashi finally sighed. I'll do whatever I have to get out of here. Inoichi smiled. I thought you'd say something like that. Oh, great. Was he getting predictable in his old age? Come on, Haddock-san, Inoichi said, rising to his feet and nodding towards the door. Let's go get you released. What if Naruto acts like Kakashi-sensei? And thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.